They called him cursed. They called him monster. But the truth about King Caelric was worse than any nightmare this kingdom ever dreamed, because he wasn't the thing they should have been afraid of. He was the only thing standing between them and something that would eat their sanity whole. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story that will change how you see every king, every crown, every sacrifice made in the dark where nobody's watching. Stay with me until the very end. Drop a like if this hooks you. And comment your city. I want to know where my people are listening from tonight. This one's going to hurt.
Bye.
The blood moon didn't rise. It clawed its way up, slow and swollen, like something wounded dragging itself over the horizon. The light it threw was wrong, not red, not orange, something in between that made the walls of Ashenmere Castle look like they were bleeding from the inside. Sergeant Harlan Breck stood at the eastern gate with 16 men behind him and a knot in his gut that had been tightening since noon. He was 53 years old. He'd fought in the Salt Plains campaign. He'd buried his first wife and his second son in the same winter. He did not scare easy. But tonight, his hands wouldn't stop shaking, and he hated himself for it. "Gates sealed," his lieutenant said. Young kid, Darrow. Couldn't grow a full beard yet, but swung a sword like he'd been born angry. "You want the crossbows on the parapet, or down here with us?" "Parapet," Breck said. "And tell them if anything comes out of that tree line, they shoot first. They don't wait for it to introduce itself." Darrow almost smiled. Almost. "And the king?" Breck watched the last sliver of white sun vanish beneath the western ridge. His jaw tightened until his molars ached. "The king does what the king does. Our job is the gate." "Harlan." Darrow lowered his voice, stepped closer. 3 men from the last detail still haven't spoken. Grint sits in the barracks staring at the wall. Doesn't eat, doesn't sleep, just sits there moving his lips like he's talking to someone none of us can see. "I know. So what happened to them in that forest?" Breck turned and looked Darrow dead in the eye. The kid had freckles across his nose and a scar on his chin from a training accident 2 years back. He looked like somebody's nephew. He looked like he deserved an honest answer. "I don't know," Breck said. "And if you're smart, you'll stop asking." Behind them, the castle's inner courtyard erupted in the sound of hooves on stone. Both men turned. A column of the king's guard, 12 riders in black armor, thundered toward the northern passage that led to the Blackthorn Forest Road. At their center, mounted on a warhorse the color of charcoal, rode King Caelric. He wore no crown, no ceremonial cloak, just battered riding leather and a long sword strapped across his back that looked like it had seen more work than decoration. His face was sharp-boned, weathered beyond his 38 years, and his eyes. Breck had always hated looking at his eyes during a blood moon. They carried something behind them, something that looked like a man trying to hold a door shut while the whole world pushed from the other side. Caelric didn't slow as he passed the eastern gate. He didn't look at Breck or the soldiers stationed there. His gaze was locked straight ahead, toward the black smear of forest on the northern horizon. The column passed. The hoofbeats faded. The gate stood in silence. Darrow exhaled. "Every blood moon. Same thing." "Where does he go?" Breck said nothing. He unsheathed his sword and held it against his thigh, feeling the familiar weight of it, letting the cold steel remind him that he was still solid, still here, still a man standing on stone instead of whatever those men in the barracks had become. The moon climbed higher. The light turned everything to rust. 3 miles south of the castle, in a cramped stone cottage that smelled of dried rosemary and old blood, Leora Vale was arguing with her mother. "You cannot go out tonight." Marin Vale stood between her daughter and the door like she was blocking a siege. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet, with hands that could set a shattered bone and eyes that could make a grown soldier confess his sins. She had healed half the villages within a day's ride of Ashenmere. She had delivered babies in rainstorms and stitched wounds by candlelight during the Salt Plains campaign. She was terrified of her own daughter. Cale didn't come home. Leora's voice was flat, not calm. Flat. The kind of flat that sits on top of panic like a lid on a boiling pot. He left this morning to gather foxwort near the northern creek, and he did not come home. "It's the blood moon, Leora. People stay in during the blood moon." Cale is 12 years old. He doesn't stay anywhere if he doesn't want to. You know that. Myron flinched. She did know that. Her son had her stubbornness and his dead father's restlessness, and the combination made him the kind of boy who wandered too far, climbed too high, stayed out too late. On any other night, it would have been an annoyance. Tonight, it was a death sentence. "The patrols will find him," Marin said. "Sergeant Breck has men along the—" "Sergeant Breck's men don't go past the creek after dark. Nobody does. You know that too." "Leora." "He's my brother." "And you're my daughter. I will not lose both of you to that forest in one night." Leora stopped. She looked at her mother, and for a moment the mask dropped. Underneath was something raw and ragged, something that looked like a girl of 22 who had already buried her father and learned to live with the particular cruelty of losing someone you couldn't save. That wound had never healed right. It had scarred over crooked, and the scar tissue made her reckless the way scar tissue sometimes makes skin tighter, harder, less willing to bend. "Mama," she said, quieter now. "I watched Papa die in this room because nobody would ride to get the surgeon in time. Because it was raining, because the road was bad, because everyone had a reason to stay warm and safe while he bled out on your table. I'm not going to sit in this house and wait for someone to bring me my brother's body." Marin's chin trembled. Her eyes went wet. She didn't move from the door. "He's probably in the miller's barn," Marin whispered. "He hides there sometimes when he's—" "I checked. He's not there. He's not at the creek. He's not at Tannen's farm. I've been to every place he goes, Mama. Every place except the one we don't talk about." Silence. The candle on the table flickered. Outside, the blood moonlight crept through the window shutters like fingers reaching in. "The forest," Marin said. "The forest." "No, I'm not asking." Marin closed her eyes. When she opened them, there was something ancient in her face, something inherited from women who had made impossible choices in dark rooms for centuries. She stepped aside. Leora moved past her. She grabbed her pack from the hook near the door. Heavy canvas, already loaded with field supplies, a skinning knife, 2 water skins, and the battered leather case of healing tools her father had given her when she was 14. She pulled on her hooded traveling cloak, the dark green one with the torn hem that she kept meaning to mend and never did. "If you're not back by dawn," Marin said to her back, "I will burn that forest to the ground." Leora didn't turn around. Her hand was on the door latch. "I know you will," she said, and she was gone. The northern road was empty. That was wrong. Even during a blood moon, there should have been late travelers, a merchant's wagon, a farmer trying to get one last load to market before lockdown. But the road was dirt and silence and that awful rust-colored light painting everything like a wound. Leora walked fast. She had long legs and a stride that ate distance, and she used both now. Her boots were good, calf-high, laced tight, the soles thick enough to handle rough ground. Her father had taught her to always take care of her boots. "Feet are the only friends that never leave you," he used to say. "Fix your boots before you fix your problems." She missed him so much it felt like a physical weight she carried in her chest. Not the dramatic, poetic kind of grief that bards sang about in taverns. The ugly kind. The kind that hit you sideways on a Tuesday afternoon when you smelled wood smoke or heard a dog bark a certain way. The kind that never announced itself, just showed up, sat down, stayed. The blackthorn forest appeared ahead like a wall of darkness. The tree line was sharp against the sky, each trunk black as iron, the canopy so dense that the blood moon's light stopped dead at the edge. It didn't filter through, didn't dapple, just stopped, as if the forest had made a decision about what it would and would not allow. Leora slowed. Her hand found the skinning knife on her belt. It was a poor weapon. 6 inches of curved steel meant for separating hide from muscle. But it was sharp, and it fit her hand, and sometimes that was all you needed. She thought about Kyle, 12 years old, skinny as a fence rail, hair that stuck up in the back no matter how much she wet it down. He had their father's eyes, dark, too serious for a kid, and a laugh that came out of him like something escaping. When he laughed, really laughed, it made everyone around him feel like the world was simpler than it actually was. She would do anything for that laugh. She would walk into a cursed forest on a blood moon for that laugh. She stepped past the tree line. The change was immediate. The air went cold, not the clean cold of winter, a wet, heavy cold that pressed against her skin like a damp cloth. The smell shifted too, earth and rot and something metallic underneath, like old copper left in standing water. The trees were massive, their trunks knotted and twisted in ways that didn't look natural. Branches reached across the path like arms trying to pull it shut behind her. Lyora kept walking. The path narrowed. The moonlight was gone now, swallowed by the canopy. She moved by feel, one hand on the nearest trunk, her feet testing each step before committing her weight. Then she heard it. Hooves. Ahead of her, distant but unmistakable. A column of riders moving fast through the forest on a path she couldn't see. The king. She crouched low behind a massive root system that jutted from the ground like a broken rib cage. The hoofbeats grew louder. She pressed herself flat against the wood, her heartbeat hammering so loud she was sure it would give her away. Through the gaps in the roots, she caught glimpses, black armor, dark horses, the glint of steel. And at the center, Kaelric. His face was pale. Not the pale of fear. The pale of a man already in pain, enduring something he couldn't stop. He was muttering. She could barely hear it over the horses, but she caught fragments. Not a command, not a prayer. Something that sounded like counting, like a man ticking down the seconds before something terrible arrived. The column passed. The hoofbeats faded into the deep forest, and then a new sound rose in their wake. A low hum, felt more than heard, vibrating through the ground and up through the roots into Leora's palms. It wasn't a natural sound. It had no beginning, no end. It just was. Like the forest had a heartbeat of its own, slow and huge and wrong. She forced herself to stand, forced her legs to move. The path forked. Left was wider, well-traveled. The king's road, beaten flat by years of hooves. Right was narrow, choked with undergrowth, barely visible. At the mouth of the right fork, caught on a thorn branch at waist height, was a strip of cloth. Blue cloth. Cotton. Torn from a shirt. Kael's shirt. Leora ripped it free and pressed it to her face. It smelled like him. Dirt and soap and that weird sweetness that 12-year-old boys carried when they'd been running all day. She shoved the strip into her pack and took the right path. The undergrowth grabbed at her. Branches whipped her face and arms. She pushed through, ignoring the scratches, ignoring the blood she felt trickling down her left cheek where a thorn had caught her. The path climbed, then dropped into a ravine she hadn't expected. She half slid, half fell down the slope, catching herself on a root at the bottom with a jolt that nearly dislocated her shoulder. She lay there for a moment, breathing hard. The cold air burned her lungs. Above her, visible through a break in the canopy, the blood moon hung like an accusation. "Get up," she told herself. Her voice sounded small and swallowed. "Get up, Leora." She got up. At the bottom of the ravine, a creek ran shallow over stones. The water was black in the darkness, but when she dipped her hand in, it was ice cold and clear. She drank, then splashed her face. The cut on her cheek stung. On the far bank, she found a boot print in the mud. Small, child-sized. The tread pattern was wrong, too smooth, like someone running in house shoes instead of proper boots. Kael had been wearing his old pair, the ones with the worn-down soles that Marin kept telling him to throw out. "You ridiculous kid," Leora muttered. She followed the prints. The tracks led deeper into the forest, into a section where the trees grew so close together that she had to turn sideways to squeeze between them. The bark was wet against her hands, slick with something that might have been moss or might have been something else. She tried not to think about it. Then the trees opened. She stood at the edge of a clearing she had never seen, never heard described in any story or map. The ground was stone, ancient flagstone, cracked and heaved by centuries of root growth, but unmistakably carved, deliberately placed. In the center of the clearing, half swallowed by earth and vegetation, was a structure. Stone walls, a broken archway, steps leading down into the earth, ruins, old ones, older than the castle, older than Ashenmere, older than anything Leora had ever seen in the kingdom. And from below the ruins, from whatever lay beneath those descending steps, came light. Not moonlight, not firelight. A cold blue-white glow that pulsed in rhythm with the humming she'd felt through the roots earlier. The heartbeat of the forest. The heartbeat of something underground. Leora stared at the descending stairs. Every survival instinct she had screamed at her to turn back. The hairs on her arms were standing straight up. Her body knew this was wrong in the same way an animal knows a storm is coming. Wordless, cellular, absolute. She went down the stairs. The temperature dropped with each step. The stone beneath her feet was smooth, worn by passage, and the walls on either side were carved with symbols she couldn't read. Not the common script used in Ashenmere, not the old trade language of the coast. Something else, something that predated both by centuries. The carvings seemed to shift when she looked at them from the corner of her eye, rearranging themselves like living things. But when she turned her head to look directly, they were still. The stairway ended in a corridor. The blue-white light was brighter here, coming from somewhere ahead. The humming was louder, too, and she could feel it in her teeth now, a vibration that settled into her jaw and made her fillings ache. She heard voices. Not the king's, not soldiers. Something else, a low chanting, guttural and rhythmic, that rose and fell like breathing. And underneath it, threaded through it like a wire through cloth, was a sound that turned her blood to ice. A child crying. Leora ran. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She ran down the corridor toward the sound, her knife in her hand, her pack bouncing against her hip. The corridor twisted left, then right, then opened into a massive chamber that stole every rational thought from her mind. The chamber was cathedral vast. The ceiling vanished into darkness far above. The walls were covered in those same shifting symbols, but here they glowed, pulsing in sync with the humming, throbbing with that sickly blue-white light. The floor was a mosaic of interlocking stone circles, each one inscribed with patterns that hurt to look at, that made the eyes slide away like oil on water. At the chamber's center stood a column of raw stone, 20 feet tall, cracked down the middle like something inside it was trying to get out. Chains, real chains, iron black and ancient, wrapped the column from base to apex, and at the base of the column, slumped against the stone, was Kale. He was alive. His eyes were open, but he wasn't seeing this room. He was seeing something else, something far away and terrible, and tears ran down his face in silent, unbroken streams. His lips were moving, no sound. Kale! Leora's voice cracked. Kale, it's me! I'm here! He didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge her existence. His eyes were fixed on the cracked column, and whatever he was seeing inside it had taken him somewhere she couldn't reach. Leora dropped to her knees beside him. She grabbed his shoulders, shook him. Kale. Kale, look at me. Look at me right now. Nothing. His skin was cold. Not dead cold, but close. Like the warmth was being pulled out of him slowly, steadily, the way the forest pulled light out of the moonlight, stolen by degrees. She turned to the column. Up close, the crack was wider than it had appeared. She could see into it, barely. And what she saw inside was darkness that moved. Not shadow, not absence of light. Darkness as a substance, thick and liquid, pressing against the inside of the stone like something breathing against the walls of a cage. The chains groaned. A link near the base, one link out of thousands, snapped. The sound was small, almost delicate, a musical ping that echoed through the vast chamber. The humming changed pitch, went deeper, lower, the kind of low that lived in the spine, not the ears. What is this place? Leora whispered. You shouldn't be here. She spun. Kaelric stood at the chamber's entrance. His soldiers were gone. He was alone, and he looked like a different man than the one she'd glimpsed on the road. The riding leathers were the same, but the body inside them was rigid with a tension so profound it looked like agony. His eyes were different, too. The brown was shot through with veins of cold light, the same blue-white as the glowing symbols, and they pulsed in the same rhythm. He was connected to this place, physically. Whatever was in this chamber had its hooks in him. My brother, Leora said. She stood. The knife was still in her hand. What have you done to my brother? I haven't done anything to him. He came here on his own. Kids do that sometimes during the blood moon. The pull gets stronger, draws in anyone with... He stopped, his jaw clenched. A tendon stood out in his neck like a cable. Anyone with what? It doesn't matter. You need to take him and leave. Now. Before it gets worse. Before what gets worse? What is this place? What is that thing in the pillar? Kaelric crossed the chamber in 4 strides. He moved fast for a man who looked like he was holding himself together through sheer force of will. He knelt beside Kale, pressed 2 fingers to the boy's forehead, and closed his eyes. The blue-white light in the symbols flared. Kale gasped, shuddered, and his eyes snapped into focus for the first time. Leora? His voice was small, confused, scared. What? I'm here. She pulled him into her arms. He was shaking. His whole body trembled against her chest like a trapped bird. I've got you. You're okay. I saw something, Kael whispered. Inside the rock. It was looking at me. It knew my name. Kaelric stood. His face was a mask, but his hands were shaking, just like Brex had been at the gate. And for the same reason. Fear. Raw, unfiltered, incapacitating fear, held in check by nothing but stubbornness and pride. Take him up the stairs, Kaelric said. Follow the corridor to the surface. Turn left at the fork. Don't stop. Don't look back. And don't come back here. Ever. Leora stood, pulling Kael to his feet. The boy leaned against her, barely able to support his own weight. She looked at Kaelric, really looked at him, past the command in his voice and the authority in his posture. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, carved deep enough to look like bruises. She saw the way his left hand pressed against his ribs like something inside hurt. She saw the thin scar that ran from his right temple down to his jaw, white against weathered skin, and the way his lips were cracked and dry like a man who had forgotten to drink water for days. This was not a monster. This was not a curse. This was a man standing alone inside a nightmare, holding a door shut with his own body because nobody else knew the door existed. How long? She asked. Kaelric blinked. What? How long have you been coming down here? Holding this together by yourself? How long? Something moved behind his eyes, something that looked like surprise, then pain, then a gratitude so enormous and so quickly suppressed that she almost missed it. Since I was 19, he said, the night my father died. He held the seal before me, his father before him. It goes back centuries. The blood moon weakens it, every time. And every time, someone from the bloodline has to come down here and hold it together until the moon passes. Alone? The soldiers escort me to the forest. They don't come underground. The ones who have the seal does things to people who aren't blood-tied to it, breaks something in them, in their minds. They can't process what they see down here, so their brains just, he made a vague gesture, shut down. That's what happened to Grint and the others who came back wrong. He looked at her sharply. You know about that? Everyone knows about it. The whole kingdom knows something happens during the blood moon. They just don't know what. They can't know what. If people understood what was down here, what was inside that pillar, the fear alone would feed it. The Hollow King doesn't need to escape to destroy this kingdom. It just needs people to be afraid of it. Leora looked at the cracked column. The darkness inside it moved again. Slower now, but somehow more deliberate. Like something pacing, waiting. The Hollow King, she repeated. Verethan, Kaelric said the name like it cost him something. 300 years ago, he sat on the same throne I sit on. He wanted to live forever. Found the old power buried under this forest. Something that predates every kingdom, every empire, every civilization we know about. He drank from it, and it ate him alive, turned him into something that wasn't human anymore, something that feeds on fear and madness and makes more of what it eats. And your ancestor sealed him down here. My ancestor nearly died sealing him down here. It took the blood of the royal line to create the prison, and it takes the blood of the royal line to maintain it, every generation, every blood moon, without fail. The chains groaned again. Another link, higher up this time, cracked. Didn't break. Not yet. But the crack was visible, a hairline fracture running through iron that was supposed to be unbreakable. Kaelric's face went gray. That's happening faster, he said, more to himself than to her. Much faster than last month. Is it supposed to happen at all? No, the chains hold, they've always held. For 3 centuries, the seal weakens during the blood moon, and then it strengthens again. But this year, something changed. The links are failing. The cracks in the column are widening. Every blood moon, I come down here and the damage is worse. So the seal is breaking. Yes. The word sat between them like a stone dropped into still water. Leora felt the ripples of it move through her chest, through Kael, who pressed tighter against her side. Can you fix it? I've been trying. For 8 months. Every tool the bloodline passed down, every ritual, every piece of knowledge encoded in the royal archives. Nothing works. The seal isn't just weakening from age. Something is accelerating it, something deliberate. You think someone is doing this on purpose? Kelrick looked at her. The blue-white light in his eyes pulsed, and in that pulse, she saw something terrifying. Not the monster below, but the exhaustion of a man who had been fighting an invisible war for nearly 20 years and was watching himself lose. I know someone is doing this on purpose, he said. I just don't know who. The chamber shook. A tremor, brief but violent, that sent dust cascading from the ceiling and cracked the flagstone under Leora's feet. Kale yelped. The symbols on the walls flared, not pulsing this time, but blazing, white-hot, and from inside the column came a sound. A voice. Low, patient, amused. It didn't speak in words. It spoke in feelings, in images that invaded Leora's mind without permission. She saw her father dying on her mother's table. She saw Kale's body floating face down in black water. She saw herself alone, truly alone, standing in the middle of an empty world where everyone she'd ever loved was gone. She gasped, staggered, almost dropped Kale. Don't listen, Kelrick commanded. He grabbed her arm, and his grip was iron hard, anchoring her to the present. It shows you what you're most afraid of. It reads fear like a book. The more you engage, the stronger it gets. Leora shook her head, hard, like shaking off water. The images receded. Not gone. Crouching. Waiting at the edges of her mind like predators in tall grass. Take your brother, Kelrick said. Get out. Now. What about you? I'll hold it until the moon passes. Same as every month. You just told me the seal is failing, that it's worse every time. How many more months do you have before it breaks completely? He didn't answer, which was its own answer. You don't know, she said. You might not make it through tonight. That's not your problem. You're wrong about that. He looked at her. Not like a king looking at a subject, like a man looking at someone who had just said the one thing he'd needed to hear for 19 years and never had. I'm a healer, Leora said. It's what I do. I find what's broken, and I fix it. And you... She looked at the column, at the chains, at the pulsing symbols on the walls. All of this is broken, and you've been trying to hold it together with willpower and bloodline tradition, and it's killing you. Anyone can see that. You can't help with this. You don't have the blood. Maybe not, but I have something you don't. What? Fresh eyes. You've been staring at this so long you can't see it anymore. You need someone from outside the bloodline, outside the royal line, outside the whole system. Someone who'll look at this and ask the obvious questions that nobody inside it thinks to ask. And what obvious question would that be? Leora held his gaze. The blue-white light pulsed between them. Below, the Hollow King shifted in its prison, and the chains sang a low metallic note that she felt in her bones. If the seal held for 300 years, she said, and now it's suddenly failing, you're not looking for a what, you're looking for a who. And I'd bet everything I have that whoever is breaking this seal is standing close enough to you that you see them every day and never suspect. Kelrick's face changed. Something behind his eyes clicked into place. A connection he'd been too close to see, too exhausted to make, too alone to think through clearly. The court, he whispered. The court. Another tremor. Harder this time. A chain link near the top of the column snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. The darkness inside the crack surged, pressing outward, and for one terrible instant, Leora saw a face in the darkness. Not human, not anymore. But it had been once. It had been a king once. And it was smiling. Kelrick threw both hands forward. The light in his eyes blazed. The symbols on the walls screamed. There was no other word for it. And the column sealed, the crack closing by fractions. The darkness forced back behind stone. The effort drove Kelrick to his knees. Blood ran from his nose and dripped onto the ancient floor. His whole body convulsed, once, twice, and then he was still, kneeling in a puddle of his own blood, breathing in ragged, broken gasps. Leora didn't move. She watched a king bleed on the floor of a chamber. Nobody knew existed to hold back a horror nobody believed was real, and she understood in that moment, with the same clarity she'd had the night her father died, that if she walked away now, this man would die alone in the dark, just like every king before him. Kale, she said, can you stand? Her brother nodded. He was pale, still shaking, but his eyes were his own again. I need you to go up the stairs, follow the corridor, turn left at the fork, run until you hit the tree line, Then follow the road south to the cottage. Tell Mama what happened. What about you? I'm staying. Leora. I'm staying, Kale. The boy looked at her, then at Kaelric, still on his knees, still bleeding, then back at his sister. Something passed across his 12-year-old face that was far too old, far too knowing, far too much like their father. I'll bring help, he said. There is no help. Just go. Be safe. Tell Mama I'll be home by dawn. Kale ran. His footsteps echoed up the corridor, growing fainter, faster, until they vanished. Leora turned back to Kaelric. She knelt beside him. Her healing instincts took over. She checked his pulse, tilted his head, pressed her palm against his forehead. His skin was burning hot despite the cold. His pulse was wild and erratic, a heart working 3 times as hard as it should. You're going to kill yourself doing this, she said. Probably. Tonight? Maybe. That's not good enough. He looked at her, blood on his lips, blue-white light dying in his eyes. I don't have anything better to offer. Then we find something better, together, starting now. You don't know what you're signing up for. I never do. That hasn't stopped me yet. Above them, through hundreds of feet of stone and earth and ancient wood, the blood moon reached its apex. In the castle, soldiers gripped their weapons and stared at the tree line. In the villages, mothers held their children and prayed for dawn. And in a chamber beneath the world, a healer's daughter sat beside a bleeding king and watched the chains on a monster's prison crack, one link at a time, while something ancient and patient and hungry pressed against the walls of its cage and whispered promises into the dark. The Hollow King could wait. It had waited 300 years. But somewhere in the castle above, in a chamber of silk and silver, behind a door guarded by men loyal to the wrong master, a hand moved across a desk. A seal was pressed into wax. A message was written, folded, and handed to a courier who disappeared into the blood moon night. The message contained 3 words. The seal breaks. And the man who wrote it, the man with the patient smile, the trusted voice, the seat at the king's own table, leaned back in his chair, poured himself a glass of wine, and waited for the sound of chains shattering beneath the earth. The blood hadn't dried on the chamber floor before Kaelric tried to stand. He got halfway up, one knee off the stone, and his body quit on him. His arms buckled. He went down hard, catching himself on his palms, and the sound he made wasn't pain, it was fury. The low, guttural sound of a man who had demanded everything from his own body for 19 years and was now being told the account was empty. Leora didn't rush to help him. She'd learned that from her father, from watching Marin work on soldiers who came back from the salt plains with their pride wound tighter than their bandages. You didn't grab a wounded man. You let him fail on his own terms first. Then you moved in. Kaelric tried again. Made it to one knee. Stayed there, breathing in shallow, ragged pulls that sounded wet. His nose was still bleeding, a slow trickle that ran down his chin and dripped onto the ancient stone in a rhythm that matched the pulse of the symbols on the walls. Your lungs are compromised, Leora said. Flat, clinical. Not asking permission to assess him. You're pulling air into your upper chest only. That means your diaphragm is spasming, which means your body just took a hit it wasn't built to take. If you try to stand again in the next 2 minutes, you'll pass out, and I'm not strong enough to carry you up those stairs. He looked at her sideways, blood on his teeth when he spoke. You always talk to kings like that? I've never talked to a king before. I talk to patients like that. Sit down. He sat. Not because she told him to, because his body gave him no choice. He leaned back against the base of the cracked column, the one that held the Hollow King, and Leora watched him do it without flinching, the way a man leans against a wall he's leaned against 1,000 times, even if there's something inside that wall trying to eat the world. She opened her pack, pulled out a water skin and a strip of clean linen, wet the linen, handed it to him. He pressed it against his face, wiped the blood, and drank from the water skin in long, desperate swallows. She watched his throat work, watched the tension in his jaw slowly, incrementally, ease by a fraction. The seal will hold until dawn, he said. It always does once the worst of the moon passes. But tomorrow night it'll be weaker again, and the night after that. We're on a clock. How long? 3 blood moons, maybe 4. After that, the column cracks open and nothing holds him. Then we have 3 months to find whoever is sabotaging it. He lowered the water skin. looked at her with those eyes, brown shot through with veins of dying blue-white light, like cracks in old pottery filled with something luminous and wrong. We? Did I stutter? You don't owe me anything. This isn't about owing. My brother was down here, pulled here by whatever that thing is. If the seal breaks, he's at risk. My mother's at risk. Every person in every village within 100 miles is at risk. You said this thing feeds on fear and madness. You think I'm going to sit in my cottage and wait for it? Kaelric studied her. Not the way a king studies a subject, measuring usefulness, calculating loyalty. He studied her the way a man studies something he doesn't understand, something that doesn't fit the patterns he's learned to expect. You're going to get yourself killed, he said. Probably. That doesn't bother you? Everything bothers me. I just don't let it make my decisions. The chamber fell quiet. The symbols on the walls had dimmed to a low, sullen glow. The humming was still there. It never stopped, but it had retreated to a lower register, a bass note felt in the bones rather than heard. The Hollow King was resting, conserving. It had tested the chains and found them still intact, and now it was settling back into the patient, ageless weight that had sustained it for 3 centuries. But the cracks in the column were wider than they'd been an hour ago. Even Leora could see that. Tell me about the court, she said. Kaelric closed his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of the command it carried in public. What was left underneath was quieter, tired. The voice of a man talking to someone in a dark room because there was nobody else to talk to. 14 members of the High Council, 6 noble houses, 2 military commanders, the Lord Chancellor, the Master of Coin, the Keeper of Records, the Royal Physician, and my chief advisor, Lord Malverin. Who do you trust? His laugh was short, dry, and entirely without humor. I trust my horse. I'm serious. So am I. Trust is a luxury I stopped affording a long time ago. Every person in that court wants something. Land, titles, trade routes, military contracts. They smile, they bow, they tell me what I want to hear, and behind closed doors they cut deals and build alliances and position themselves for the day I stop being useful. That's how courts work. That's how they've always worked. But one of them is doing something different. One of them isn't just playing politics. One of them is actively trying to break the seal. Yes. Which means one of them knows about this place, about the Hollow King, about all of it. Kaelric opened his eyes. That's what keeps me up at night. The bloodline is supposed to be the only line of knowledge, father to son, generation to generation. Nobody outside the royal blood is supposed to know this chamber exists, but someone does. And they've been using that knowledge to weaken the seal from the outside while I fight to hold it from the inside. How would they even do that? Weaken the seal from outside? There are anchor points, 5 of them, spread throughout the forest, stone markers tied to the seal's foundation. If you corrupt the markers, you corrupt the seal. I found 2 of them damaged in the last 8 months. Symbols defaced. The stone cracked in ways that aren't natural. Someone who understood the old language, who knew where the markers were, who had access to the knowledge. Someone who'd been told, or who found the records. The royal archives. There are texts in there that go back to the founding. Most of it is genealogy and tax records, but buried inside the older volumes there are references to the seal. Coded, encrypted in the old script. But if someone spent enough time, if someone had access and patience and motivation, they could have decoded it. Yes. Leora pulled her knees up to her chest. The cold of the chamber was settling into her bones now, a deep, persistent chill that her cloak couldn't touch. She thought about what she knew, what she'd seen, what she could piece together. You need me inside the castle, she said. Kaelric's eyes sharpened. No. You can't investigate your own court. You're the king. The moment you start asking questions, whoever is behind this knows you're onto them. They go quiet. They cover their tracks. Or worse, they accelerate the timeline and break the seal before you can stop them. And what are you going to do? Walk into the castle and start interrogating nobles? You're a healer's daughter from a village. You don't have access. You don't have standing. You don't have... I have something better. I'm invisible. He stopped. Nobody in that court knows who I am, Leora said. Nobody cares about a village healer. If I'm inside the castle, working in the infirmary, tending to servants, doing the work that nobody important pays attention to. I can go places you can't. Talk to people who would never speak honestly to a king. Servants hear everything. Kitchen staff, stable hands, the women who clean the council chambers after the lords go home. They know who visits whom at odd hours. They know who sends messages in the dark. They know who's lying because they're the ones who clean up the evidence. Kaelric stared at her. The last traces of blue-white light faded from his eyes, leaving them fully brown, fully human, and full of something she couldn't quite name. It might have been hope. It might have been terror. With men like him, it was hard to tell the difference. Malvern will notice, he said. Quieter now, testing the idea rather than rejecting it. He notices everything. It's what makes him useful. It's what makes him dangerous. Then don't announce me. Don't assign me to anything official. The infirmary always needs hands. Marin, my mother, she's been asked a dozen times to send someone to help with the castle's medical staff. She always says no because she doesn't trust the court. But if she sent me, it would look routine. A village healer rotating in. Nobody worth a second glance. And while you're cleaning wounds and mixing poultices, you'll be watching. I'll be listening. There's a difference. The column behind Kaelric's back groaned. A low tectonic sound, like the earth itself was shifting. He didn't flinch. He'd been hearing that sound for 19 years. It was the background noise of his life, the constant reminder that everything he held together could come apart at any moment. If they find out what you're doing, he said, they won't arrest you. They'll kill you, quietly. An accident, a fall from a stairwell, poison in your food. These people, whoever they are, they've been planning this for months, maybe years. They're not going to let a healer's daughter from the South Village dismantle their work. Then I'll have to be better at this than they expect. You're not trained for this. I'm not trained for a lot of things I've done. I set my own father's broken leg when I was 16 because my mother was delivering a baby on the other side of the valley, and there was nobody else. I dug a crossbow bolt out of a man's shoulder with a kitchen knife because the proper surgical tools were in a locked cabinet, and there wasn't time to find the key. I have never once in my life had the right tools for the job. I make do. It's what I'm good at. Kaelric was quiet for a long time. The chamber breathed around them. That deep, slow, underground breath that was partly the seal and partly the thing behind it. Leora let the silence sit. She'd learned that too, from years of working with patients. Sometimes the most important thing you could do was shut up and let someone make their own decision. There's a corridor behind the Royal Archives, Kaelric said finally. Old service passage. Hasn't been used in decades. The entrance is behind a tapestry on the east wall of the lower library. It connects to the infirmary wing through a series of maintenance tunnels. You're telling me this because? Because if you're going to spy on my court, you need a way to reach me without being seen. I'll leave messages in the corridor. You do the same. We don't meet in public. We don't acknowledge each other. As far as anyone in the castle knows, you and I are strangers. Leora nodded. Something tight in her chest loosened. Not relief exactly, but the feeling of a plan taking shape. Bones finding their alignment. The first splint applied to a fracture. Not yet healed, but at least held in place. One more thing, Kaelric said. He reached inside his riding leather and pulled out a small object. A ring. Silver, plain, undecorated except for a single symbol etched into the interior of the band. The symbol matched the ones on the walls. Wear this under your clothes. Never let anyone see it. If the seal begins to fail while I'm not here, if you feel the pull, the way your brother felt the pull, this will keep you anchored. It's blood bonded to the royal line. It won't give you power, but it'll keep the Hollow King from getting inside your head. She took the ring. It was warm despite the cold of the chamber, warmer than it should have been, as if something alive was coiled inside the metal. Your father's? She asked. My mother's. She died before she could use it. He said it the way he said everything, flat, contained, locked down. But Leora heard the crack beneath the words, the hairline fracture running through a man who had been carrying weight too long and too alone. She slipped the ring onto a cord around her neck and tucked it under her shirt. They climbed the stairs together. Kaelric moved slowly, one hand bracing against the wall, his breathing still ragged but improving. Leora stayed behind him, not hovering, but close enough to catch him if he fell. He didn't fall. Whatever was breaking inside him hadn't broken yet. The forest was different when they emerged. The blood moon had passed its apex and was beginning its descent, and the quality of the light had shifted from that aggressive rust to something paler, more exhausted. The trees were still massive, still twisted, still wrong, but the oppressive weight of the air had lifted slightly, like a fist unclenching by one finger. Kaelric's horse waited where he'd left it, tied to a trunk near the ruins. The animal was wild-eyed and sweating, its ears flat back, every muscle twitching. It had spent hours alone in a cursed forest during a blood moon, and it had not bolted, loyalty or fear, maybe both. "The castle will send riders to collect me at the forest edge," Kaelric said. "You should be well south of here before they arrive. Nobody can see us together." Leora nodded. She turned to go, then stopped. "Your soldiers. The ones who come into the forest and come back wrong. What do you tell them before they follow you in?" Kaelric's hand rested on his horse's neck. The animal gradually calmed under his touch, the trembling easing by degrees. "I tell them not to follow. They follow anyway, because they're loyal, because they think I need protection." A muscle jumped in his jaw. "I've ordered them not to. I've threatened court-martial. I've begged. Some of them still follow, and then I lose them." "You can't keep losing people." "No, I can't." "Then we fix this. Fast." She left him standing in the ruins with his horse and the memory of every person he'd failed to protect. She walked south through the forest, following the path Kael had taken, and she didn't look back. Not because she didn't want to. Because looking back was what you did when you were afraid, and she had made a decision to be something else tonight. Dawn was breaking when she reached the cottage. Gray light, thin and watery, pushing through clouds that had gathered while she was underground. Merrin was standing in the doorway. She'd been standing there for hours. Leora could see it in the way her mother's legs were locked, the way her hands gripped the doorframe, the way her face was a mask of controlled terror that crumbled the instant she saw her daughter emerge from the tree line. Kael was asleep inside, wrapped in every blanket Merrin owned, curled on the cot nearest the fire. His color was better. His breathing was even. Whatever the Hollow King had done to him was fading, retreating like a tide going out. Merrin pulled Leora inside and shut the door like she was sealing a vault. "Tell me," Merrin said. So Leora told her. All of it. The chamber, the column, the chains, the Hollow King, the seal, the sabotage, the king bleeding on the floor of a room that nobody knew existed. She told it straight, without drama, without embellishment, the way her father had taught her to present a diagnosis. Facts first, speculation second, emotion never. Merrin listened without interrupting. When Leora finished, her mother was quiet for a very long time. She stood at the table where she mixed her medicines, her hands flat on the scarred wooden surface, her head bowed. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "Your father knew." Leora's world tilted sideways. "What?" "Not everything, not the details. But he knew something was beneath the forest, something connected to the royal bloodline. He treated one of the soldiers who came back wrong, Callan Bray. Do you remember him? Big man, missing 2 fingers on his left hand." "I remember. Callan came to your father instead of the royal physician because he didn't trust the castle. He was terrified. He told your father that he'd followed the king into the forest and seen things underground, things that shouldn't exist. Your father wrote it all down, everything Callan described." "Where?" "In his journals, the ones I locked in the chest after he died." "Mama, where are the journals?" Merrin looked at her, and for the first time in Leora's life, she saw something in her mother's face that wasn't fear or caution or the careful calculation of a woman who had survived by knowing when to keep her head down. She saw rage. Quiet, ancient, banked fire rage. "Under the floor," Merrin said, "where I put everything I never wanted you to find." 20 minutes later, Leora sat at the table with 3 leather-bound journals open in front of her. Her father's handwriting, small, precise, the penmanship of a man who believed clarity could save lives, filled every page. Most of it was medical, patient records, herbal formulations, surgical notes. But scattered throughout, coded in a shorthand he'd developed during the Salt Plains campaign, were entries that had nothing to do with medicine. Callan Bray's testimony took up 11 pages. Descriptions of the underground chamber that matched what Leora had seen. The column, the chains, the symbols, the blue-white light. But Callan had seen something Leora hadn't. He'd seen someone else in the forest on the night he'd followed the king. Someone who wasn't a soldier. Someone who moved through the trees with a familiarity that meant they'd been there before. Callan hadn't recognized the figure. It had been too dark, too chaotic, but he'd noticed one detail that stuck in his broken mind through all the madness that followed. The figure wore a ring, a heavy signet ring on the left hand. Gold, with a crest that Callan described in shaking, fragmented detail. A serpent eating its own tail around a crown. Leora stared at the description. She didn't know the crest, but she knew someone who would. She closed the journals, wrapped them in oilcloth, placed them in the bottom of her pack underneath the healing tools. "I'm going to the castle," she said to Marin. "I know. If anything happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you, because I raised you to be smarter than the people who would hurt you, and because your father's blood runs in you, and that man was too stubborn to die of anything less than his own body giving out." Leora crossed the room and held her mother. Marin was small in her arms, smaller than she remembered, and for a moment she felt the terrible weight of being the strong one, the one who walks into danger while the people who love you stand at the door and watch. She didn't cry. Neither did Marin. The women in their family didn't cry when someone was leaving for battle. They saved it for after. The castle at Ashenmere was a sprawling compound of gray stone and iron gates, built into the side of a hill that overlooked the valley like a closed fist. Leora arrived at midday, on foot, carrying her pack and a letter from Marin addressed to the head of the castle's medical staff, a woman named Drenna Voss, who had been requesting village support for months. The guards at the main gate barely looked at her, a healer's assistant. Young woman, worn boots, travel-stained cloak, pack full of medical supplies. Nobody. She walked through the gate and into the castle's outer ward without a single question asked. The infirmary was in the east wing, a long, low-ceilinged hall lined with cots and smelling of lye and old blood. Drenna Voss was a compact woman in her 50s with iron gray hair cropped short and eyes that assessed everything in their field of vision with the efficiency of a weapon. She read Marin's letter, looked Leora up and down, and grunted. "You know wound care? Since I was 12. Bone setting? My father taught me. Herbal compounding? Everything in Marin Vale's repertoire." Drenna grunted again. Higher pitch this time. Almost approval. "You'll sleep in the staff quarters off the east corridor. Shifts start at dawn, end at dark. No wandering, no fraternizing with the guard, no gossip." "Yes, ma'am." The soldiers in this castle break bones, tear muscles, and occasionally stab each other over card games. Fix them fast, keep your head down, and we'll get along fine. Leora was assigned a cot in a room she shared with two other medical assistants, a girl named Pella, who talked in her sleep, and an older woman named Gent, who didn't talk at all. The room was small, cold, and had a single window that looked out over the inner courtyard. From that window, if she pressed her cheek against the stone and craned her neck, she could see the entrance to the royal wing on the far side of the compound. She spent the first 3 days doing exactly what she was supposed to do. Treated a sprained ankle, cleaned an infected knife wound, mixed poultices for a guardsman with chronic back pain. She kept her head down, her mouth shut, and her eyes wide open. On the second evening, she found the tapestry Kaelric had described. East wall of the lower library, behind a faded depiction of a battle scene that nobody had dusted in years. The service passage behind it was narrow, dark, and cold. She didn't enter it. Not yet. She just confirmed it was there. Then she went back to the infirmary and dressed a cook's burned hand. By the third day, she had mapped the castle's rhythms. She knew when the guard shifts changed. She knew which corridors were busy at what hours. She knew that the kitchen staff started work at 4 in the morning and that the chambermaid who cleaned the council room arrived at 6. She knew that Lord Malverin took his breakfast alone in his quarters and that the Master of Coin had a mistress in the merchant district whom he visited every third evening. She knew these things because she listened. Because she asked small, harmless questions while wrapping bandages or mixing tinctures. Because people talk to healers the way they talk to walls, freely, without thought, as if the person applying the salve had no ears and no memory. On the 4th morning, she treated a stable hand named Rorik, who had cracked 2 ribs when a horse kicked him. While she bound his torso, she asked about the castle's daily routines, framing it as a newcomer trying to learn the layout. "You want to steer clear of the west corridor after council sessions," Rourke said through gritted teeth as she tightened the binding. "The lords come through in packs, and they'll run you down if you're in the way. Malvern especially. Man walks like he owns the stones under his feet." Malvern, he's the king's advisor? Chief advisor. Longest-serving member of the council. Been at the king's side since before the coronation. Some folks say he's the one who actually runs this place. "And the king lets him?" Rourke laughed, then winced. "Kelric lets nobody do nothing. But Malvern's smart. Doesn't push, doesn't grab, just steers. You know the type. Always suggesting, never demanding. And somehow what he suggests is always what happens. Sounds like a man who knows what he wants. Sounds like a man who already has it and wants more. Hold on, is that supposed to be that tight?" "Yes, don't breathe too deep for a week." That night, she slipped into the service corridor behind the tapestry. She moved by touch, one hand on the stone wall, her footsteps deliberate and silent on the ancient floor. The passage ran deeper than she'd expected, branching at 2 points before connecting to a wider tunnel that she recognized from Calric's description as the maintenance route to the infirmary wing. At the first junction, she found a loose stone in the wall. Behind it, a folded piece of paper. Calric's handwriting, sparse, direct, no greeting, no signature. "Malvern has requested access to the lower archives. 3rd time this month. I've denied it each time. He's looking for something. The old texts, I'm sure of it now." She turned the paper over, wrote her own note by feel in the darkness, her letters careful and deliberate. "My father's journals describe someone in the forest on a blood moon night. Not a soldier. Not the king. Wearing a gold signet ring, serpent eating its own tail around a crown. Find out whose crest that is." She folded the note, placed it behind the stone, and returned to her cot without a sound. 5 days into her posting at the castle, Leora made first contact with the enemy. She didn't plan it. The infirmary received a summons to treat a minor injury in the council wing. A lord had cut his hand on a letter opener during a meeting. Drenna was handling a surgery. Ghent was on a supply run. Pella was useless with anyone above the rank of servant. Leora went. The council chamber was a vast, vaulted room with a table that could seat 20 and walls hung with maps and banners. Most of the lords had already cleared out. 2 remained. One was a heavy-set man with a red face and the bored expression of someone who found governance tedious. The other was Lord Malvern. He was not what she expected. The stories painted him as imposing, tall, broad, the physical embodiment of authority. The real Malvern was medium height, lean, with a face that was neither handsome nor ugly, but somehow both at once. His features were sharp but not angular. His eyes were gray, true gray, like wet slate, and they settled on Leora the moment she entered the room with a weight that made her skin prickle. "The healer," he said. Not a question, an identification, like cataloging a specimen. "My lord." She crossed to the heavy-set man, who held up a palm sliced neatly across the lifeline. "Let me see that." The cut was shallow, barely needed stitching. She cleaned it, applied a salve, and wrapped it in clean linen while the heavy-set lord complained about dull blades and cheap steel. Malvern watched. He hadn't stopped watching since she entered. "You're new?" he said. "From the village?" "South Village. My mother is Marin Vale." "The healer, yes. Good reputation. She's been asked to assist the castle before." "She sent me in her place. She doesn't travel well." Malvern picked up a goblet from the table and sipped. His left hand, which wore a heavy ring that caught the light as he lifted the cup. Gold, with a crest. Leora didn't look at it. She kept her eyes on the bandage she was tying, her fingers steady, her breathing controlled. But her peripheral vision burned the image into her memory. She couldn't make out the full design from this angle. She needed a closer look. But the ring was there, on his hand, exactly where Callan Bray said it would be. "You'll find the castle is a different world from village work," Malvern said. His voice was smooth, not warm, smooth, like a blade with a fine edge that you didn't feel until you were already bleeding. "The bodies are the same, but the politics complicate everything. Stay in the infirmary, do your work. Don't get curious about things above your station." It could have been advice, it could have been a welcome. But the way he said it, The way his gray eyes held hers for one beat too long, it was neither. It was a measurement. He was taking the dimensions of her, the way a carpenter measures a piece of wood before deciding whether to cut it or discard it. "I'm not the curious type, my lord," Leora said. She smiled, a small, polite, forgettable smile. The smile of nobody important. "Good," Malvern said. "Curiosity is an expensive habit in this castle, and the bills always come due." He left. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, measured, precise, each one placed with the deliberate authority of a man who controlled the ground he walked on. Leora finished the bandage. The heavy-set lord thanked her and waddled out. She stood alone in the council chamber, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her temples, her hands trembling now that there was nobody to see them tremble. The ring on his hand. She closed her eyes, breathed, steadied. Then she walked to the door, checked the corridor, and slipped out. Back to the infirmary. Back to the bandages and the poultices and the safe, invisible work of a healer nobody noticed. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay on her cot in the dark room listening to Pella murmur in her dreams and Gent's deep, even breathing, and she thought about Malvern's eyes. Not the color, the intelligence behind them. The focused, predatory patience of a man who didn't need to rush because he had already won. He just hadn't told anyone yet. She thought about Caelric in the chamber beneath the forest, bleeding, breaking, holding the door alone. She thought about her brother in the grip of something that knew his name. She thought about her father's handwriting in the journals. Small, precise. Written by a man who believed that if you documented the truth carefully enough, someone would eventually read it and act. Someone had read it. She had. And she was going to act. Before dawn, she slipped into the service corridor one more time, found the loose stone. Behind it, a new note from Caelric. 2 words. That was all. The serpent crest. I know it. Below the words, a single line. It belongs to the house of Malvern. The stone was cold under her fingers. The corridor was black. Somewhere beneath her feet, deep in the earth, the Hollow King waited in its cracking prison, and the man who held the key to its freedom had just warned her to mind her station with a smile that never reached his eyes. Leora put the note in her pocket. She didn't write a response. There was nothing to write. The hunt had started. The prey knew the forest better than she did, and somewhere between the castle walls and the chamber underground, a clock was ticking toward a midnight that would swallow them all. She stepped out of the corridor, let the tapestry fall back into place, and walked into the gray morning light of a castle where every smile was a weapon and every silence was a grave. There was no going back now. There had never been a way back. She understood that with a clarity that tasted like iron on her tongue. The moment she'd stepped past the tree line on Blood Moon night, the moment she'd descended those stairs and seen the truth that the kingdom had been built on, she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Her old life, the cottage, the herbs, the quiet work of healing, was behind her now, separated from this moment by a wall of knowledge that changed everything it touched. She was inside the beast, and the beast was waking up. 11 days inside the castle walls, and Leora had learned to read silence the way her mother read fevers, by what it concealed, not what it showed. The castle was full of silence. It pooled in the corridors after council sessions, settled into the stones at night, collected in the spaces between words when servants spoke to one another in careful, measured tones. This was not a quiet place. It was a loud place that had learned to keep its mouth shut. She kept working. Bandages, salves, a dislocated shoulder on a guardsman who'd been thrown during mounted drills, a kitchen boy who'd burned both hands pulling a bread paddle from a stone oven, the small, endless injuries of a castle full of people living on top of each other in a building designed for war. She fixed them all. And while she fixed them, she listened. The notes in the service corridor came every 2 days now, Caelric's handwriting growing more compressed, more urgent, the letters tighter as if the words themselves were being squeezed. He had confirmed what the journals suggested. Malvern's family crest, the serpent devouring its own tail around a crown, had been officially retired 3 generations ago, when the House of Malvern was absorbed into the broader noble class through a political merger. No living member of the court should have been wearing it. The fact that Malvern still did, privately, on a ring he kept on his left hand, meant he hadn't let go of the old identity. The old claim. The old hunger. Leora dug deeper. She befriended a chambermaid named Sorrel, who cleaned the guest wing on the third floor, the wing where visiting nobles stayed during council season. Sorrel was 50, widowed, and possessed the particular invisibility of women who had spent their entire lives in service. She moved through the castle like water through cracks, present everywhere, noticed nowhere. Over shared meals in the servants' kitchen, Leora learned things the council would have executed Sorrel for knowing. She learned that Lord Malverin received sealed correspondence from outside the kingdom every 2 weeks, delivered not through the castle's official courier system, but through a private messenger who arrived after dark and left before dawn. She learned that Malverin had personally requested to oversee the renovation of the castle's lower levels 6 months ago, a project that gave him unsupervised access to the foundations, the old passages, and the sealed chambers beneath the east wing that nobody had entered in decades. She learned that 3 members of the castle guard, men loyal to Malverin, handpicked and transferred from his family's provincial estate, had been assigned to night patrol routes that conveniently overlapped with the northern gate, the gate that opened toward the Blackthorn Forest Road. She wrote it all down, not in her father's shorthand, she'd never learned the full cipher, but in a medical notation system she'd developed herself, disguised as patient records. Malverin's movements became a fever chart. His contacts became a list of symptoms. His pattern of access to restricted areas became a diagnostic timeline, and the diagnosis was terminal. On the 12th night, she left a long note for Kaelric in the service corridor. Everything she had gathered, every connection, every pattern, the private messenger, the renovation access, the guards on the northern gate, the ring. She laid it out the way her father would have. Facts first, interpretation second, conclusion third. Malverin is building a path, from the castle to the forest. He is removing barriers between himself and the seal, one by one. The renovation gave him access to the underground passages. His guards control the gate. His messenger carries information to someone outside the kingdom, someone who is helping him understand the old scripts. He is not improvising. He has been planning this for years. She waited for Kaelric's response. It came the next morning, 2 words. I know. Below it, a longer passage. I have confronted him about the archive access. He deflected, smooth, practiced. He has answers for everything because he has had years to prepare them. I cannot move against him without proof that the court will accept. His allies on the council outnumber mine. If I accuse him publicly without evidence that breaks his story apart, he will turn the court against me, and the seal will be undefended. I need more time. Leora read the note twice. Then she wrote her response and placed it behind the stone. We don't have more time. The next blood moon is in 19 days. She was right, and she was wrong, because they didn't even have 19 days. On the 14th morning, everything changed. Leora was in the infirmary mixing a poultice for a guardsman's infected wound when Drenna Voss walked in, closed the door behind her, and stood with her back against it. The older woman's face was the color of old parchment. Her hands, which Leora had never seen shake in 2 weeks of working beside her, were trembling. There's been an arrest, Drenna said. Leora's hands kept moving, grinding the herbs, steady, controlled. The way her mother had taught her, your hands are the last thing you let the panic reach. Who? Sergeant Breck, the Eastern Gate commander, taken from his post an hour ago by Malverin's men, charged with conspiracy against the crown. The mortar slipped in Leora's grip. She caught it, set it down carefully on the table. On what grounds? They found documents in his quarters, sealed letters, correspondence with parties outside the kingdom, allegedly plotting to assassinate the king during the next blood moon. Leora felt the floor shift beneath her. Not literally. The stone was solid, the castle was stable, but the world she had been building in her head, the careful architecture of her investigation, the network of facts and connections and patterns, all of it lurched sideways as the ground rules changed beneath her feet. Breck, the sergeant who had stood at the eastern gate on Blood Moon night with shaking hands and a loyalty that ran deeper than his fear. The man who had told Darrow to stop asking questions because he knew the answers were dangerous. Breck was not a conspirator. Breck was a soldier who had spent 30 years doing his job and asking nothing in return. Malverin had planted those documents. Leora was as certain of it as she had ever been of any diagnosis. The letters were fabricated, the evidence was manufactured, and the reason was clear. Breck was one of the few people in the castle who had been close enough to the Blood Moon operations to notice irregularities. Breck had seen the soldiers come back wrong. Breck had asked questions, even if he'd told Darrow not to, and Malverin was removing him from the board before he could become a problem. She needed to reach Calric, now. But the service corridor was on the other side of the castle, and the arrest had put the entire guard on alert. Extra patrols in every hallway, checkpoints at the wing transitions. The castle had clenched like a fist, and she was trapped inside it. She spent the day performing her duties with mechanical precision, while her mind raced through scenarios, calculations, contingencies. She treated patients. She mixed medicines. She smiled at the guards who came through the infirmary and asked about the arrest with the practiced concern of a newcomer who didn't understand politics. "Terrible thing," she said to one of them. "Is the king safe?" "Malvern's handling it," the guard said. "The king's been in his chambers all day. Council's been called for tomorrow morning." The king's been in his chambers, not managing the crisis, not commanding the response, contained, isolated. Malverin handling it. The walls were closing in. Leora could feel it. The patient, methodical constriction of a trap that had been set long before she arrived. Night fell. The extra patrols continued. Leora lay on her cot, staring at the dark ceiling, running permutations. She needed to get a message to Calric. She needed to warn him that Malverin was moving faster than they'd anticipated, that the arrest of Breck was the opening move in something larger, something designed to isolate the king from anyone who might help him. At the second bell past midnight, she made her move. She rose from her cot. Pella was murmuring in her sleep, caught in some private dream. Gent's breathing was deep and rhythmic. Leora slipped on her shoes, pulled her cloak around her shoulders, and opened the door. The corridor outside was empty. She could hear the patrol, boots on stone, measured and regular, moving along the main hallway 2 turns ahead. She counted the steps, timed the gap, moved. The lower library was dark. She navigated by memory, her fingers finding the tapestry on the east wall, pulling it aside, slipping behind it into the service passage. The stone closed around her like a throat. She moved by touch, her left hand on the wall, counting the steps to the first junction. She found the loose stone, reached behind it. Empty. No note from Calric. That was wrong. He had left a note every day for the past 12 days without fail. The absence screamed. She pressed deeper into the corridor, past the first junction, past the second. The passage narrowed and descended, following the old maintenance route that Calric had described. If she followed it far enough, it would connect to a network of tunnels that ran beneath the royal wing, ancient passages used by servants in a previous era, sealed off and forgotten by everyone except the king who kept their secrets. She smelled blood before she found him, not the clean copper smell of a fresh wound, something darker, older. The smell of blood that had been sitting in cold air for hours, oxidizing on stone. Calric was on the floor of the tunnel, propped against the wall at the point where the maintenance passage intersected with the deeper route toward the royal wing. His riding leathers were torn at the left side, and beneath the tear she could see the wound, a deep puncture just below the ribs, the kind made by a narrow blade pushed in with precision and pulled out clean. Not a battlefield wound, an assassination wound, the kind designed to kill slowly, to let the target walk away and believe they were fine until the internal bleeding took them down. His face was gray, his breathing was shallow and rapid, and his eyes, when they found her in the darkness, carried the flat, distant look of a man who had been calculating how long he had left and didn't like the math. "Malverin," he said. The word came out wet. "Came to my chambers. Personally. Said he needed to discuss the Breck situation. Had 2 guards with him. His guards. Not mine. They held the doors. He talked about loyalty, about the burden of the crown, about how isolated I must feel." Leora was already on her knees beside him. Her pack was open, her hands moving before her mind finished processing. She pressed a folded cloth against the wound. Hard, direct pressure. The most critical first response for internal bleeding. Calric hissed through his teeth but didn't pull away. "Then he leaned in close," Calric continued. His voice was fading at the edges, the consonants going soft. And he said, "I know about the chamber, Calric. I know about the seal. I know about the Hollow King, and I know that you are the only thing standing between me and immortality." Leora's hands kept working. She pulled a tourniquet strip from her kit, folded a second compress, began layering pressure on the wound site. The bleeding was severe, but the blade had missed the liver. She was almost certain of that. If it had hit the liver, he'd already be dead. The kidney was possible. The spleen was possible. She wouldn't know without more time and better light and tools she didn't have in a tunnel beneath a castle in the middle of the night. "He stabbed you himself?" "No. He had someone else do it. A man I didn't recognize, fast, professional, in and out before the guards moved. Malvern watched the whole time. Didn't blink, didn't flinch. Then he stepped over me while I was on the floor and said, 'The blood moon is in 17 days. By then, the seal will break, the Hollow King will rise, and I will take what your pathetic bloodline has been squatting on for 300 years. Try to enjoy the time you have left.' And then he left. His guards left. They locked my chambers from the outside. They think I'm in there bleeding out on the floor, but there's a hidden passage behind the hearth. My father showed me when I was a boy. It leads to this tunnel system. I got this far before my legs stopped working." Leora changed the compress. The first one was soaked through. Heavy, warm, useless. She applied the fresh one with both hands, leaning her weight into it. Caelric's jaw clenched. His hands gripped the stone floor on either side of him, his knuckles white. "Can you fix it?" he asked. "Not here, not with what I have. I need the infirmary. I need proper tools, clean light, suturing supplies, and something to manage the internal damage. The infirmary is inside the castle. The castle is Malvern's now." "I know." "So what do you suggest?" Leora sat back on her heels. Her hands were covered in his blood, warm, tacky, the particular dark red of venous bleeding that meant the damage was deep but not arterial. She looked at him in the near-total darkness of the tunnel. She could barely see his face, but she could hear his breathing, ragged, labored, but controlled. Still controlled. Even now, bleeding on the floor of a passage nobody knew existed, having been betrayed by the man he'd trusted most, his body failing him in the one place he couldn't afford to be weak. Even now, he was holding on. This was how he had lived for 19 years. Holding on. Through every blood moon, every night underground, every moment of agony that no one saw and no one shared. He had built himself into a wall and stood in the gap because there was nobody else. And the wall was crumbling now, and the man behind it was bleeding out, and he was still trying to hold the stones in place with his bare hands. Something shifted inside Leora. Not a decision, something deeper than a decision, something cellular. The recognition that everything she had been before this moment, the healer's daughter, the rule breaker, the girl who ran toward danger because standing still felt like dying, all of it had been training. Preparation. Rehearsal for this exact point in time, when a king was bleeding in the dark, and the world was about to end, and the only person who could do anything about it was a woman with a skinning knife and a pack full of bandages. "Drenna," she said, "the head of the infirmary. She's not Malvern's." "How do you know?" "Because she's been here for 23 years and she hates politics. She hates anyone who makes her job harder, which is everyone in the council. And she's treated the soldiers who come back from the forest. She's seen what happens to them. She knows something is wrong, even if she doesn't know what." "You trust her?" "I trust that she became a healer for the same reason I did. Because watching someone die when you could have helped is the one thing she can't live with." Caelric was silent. His breathing hitched, then steadied. The compress under her hands was growing warm again. Time was not on their side. "There's something else," he said. "Something Malvern said before he left. He said, the girl from the village, the healer's daughter. I want you to know, I noticed her the first day. I've been watching her the entire time. Tell her I said hello." The words landed in Leora's chest like a fist. Her hands froze on the compress. For 3 heartbeats, she couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't process the implications of what that meant. Malvern had known. From the beginning. He had watched her enter the castle, watched her work in the infirmary, watched her move through the corridors and befriend the servants and slip behind the tapestry into the service passage. He had watched all of it, and he had let it happen. Why? Because she was useful. Because her investigation, her careful gathering of evidence, her secret communications with the king, all of it had told Malvern exactly what Caelric knew and what he didn't. She hadn't been spying on Malvern. Malvern had been using her as a mirror, watching the king's reflection in her movements, reading the investigation through the investigator. She had been a tool, a diagnostic instrument pointed at the one person she was trying to help. Every note she'd left in the corridor, every pattern she'd identified, every connection she'd mapped, all of it had confirmed for Malvern the scope and limits of the king's knowledge. She had shown him exactly how much Calric understood and exactly how little time there was to stop him. The realization was physical. It sat in her stomach like cold iron. She felt nauseated, dizzy. Her vision blurred and she blinked it clear through sheer force. She had done this. She had walked into the castle with her clever plan and her fresh eyes and her absolute certainty that she could see what others couldn't, and she had handed the enemy a map of her allies' defenses. The arrogance of it, the sheer blinding arrogance of a 22-year-old healer's daughter who thought she could outsmart a man who had been manipulating a royal court for decades. Her father's voice, somewhere in the back of her mind, not the sentimental, sanitized memory, the real voice, rough, impatient, the voice he used when she made mistakes in the field. You don't get to feel sorry for yourself, not now. Feeling sorry is for people who have time. You don't have time. So what are you going to do? She pressed harder on the compress. Calric grunted. He played me, she said. Not a confession, a diagnosis. He plays everyone. Not anymore. Not after tonight. What are you going to do? She looked at the king, at the blood on the floor, at the darkness pressing in from both ends of the tunnel. 17 days until the blood moon. Malvern in control of the castle, the guard, the council, Calric bleeding out underground, the seal weakening, the Hollow King waiting. Everything they had built was gone. Every advantage, every plan, every carefully constructed piece of the investigation, all of it burned to ash by a man who had been 3 steps ahead from the beginning, which meant the old approach was dead. The careful approach, the measured, strategic, work from the shadows approach. It had failed. It had been anticipated, exploited, and dismantled before it ever had a chance to succeed. If they kept fighting on Malvern's terms, they would lose. He had built the board. He had placed the pieces. Every move they made within his framework was a move he had already accounted for, so they needed to stop playing his game entirely. We go underground, Leora said. Not the castle. Under it. The old passages. Your father showed you the network. You said it connects to the forest route. Can you make it that far? With help. Then we get you to the chamber, to the seal. It's the one place Malvern can't follow without the bloodline's protection. He can sabotage the markers. He can weaken the seal from outside. But he can't enter the chamber itself without the Hollow King destroying his mind. That's why he needs the seal to break. Because as long as it holds, the power is locked behind a door only your blood can open. If I go to the chamber, I can hold the seal, but I can't heal there. There's nothing down there but stone and chains and that thing in the pillar. I'll bring Drenna and supplies, and anyone else in this castle who isn't owned by Malvern. That might be a very short list. Then it'll be a very small army. Small armies move fast. She felt him almost smile. Not quite. His body was too busy dying for smiles. But something in the tension of his face shifted, some muscle near his jaw releasing by a fraction. Your brother, he said. Malvern knows about him too. If your brother carries the same sensitivity that pulled him to the chamber during the blood moon, Malvern will use him. I know. Get a message to your mother. Get Kale out of the village. Somewhere Malvern's people can't reach. I will. Leora. What? He found her hand in the darkness. His grip was weak, frighteningly weak for a man who had held a metaphysical seal together with his bare willpower for 19 years, but it was there, present, deliberate. I've been alone in this since I was 19 years old. I stopped believing anyone would ever stand in this darkness with me. I accepted that, built my life around it, made it the foundation. And now you're here, and the foundation doesn't work anymore, and I don't know what to build instead. Build something that holds more than one person. I don't know how. I know, that's why I'm here. She adjusted the compress one final time. The bleeding had slowed, not stopped, but the clotting was beginning. The body's desperate attempt to seal the breach. He needed surgery. He needed rest. He needed things she couldn't give him in a tunnel at 3 in the morning with the castle locked down above their heads. But he needed to live through the next hour first, and then the hour after that. 1 hour at a time, until she could get him somewhere safe. "Can you move?" she asked. "If I have to." "You have to." She helped him up. His weight against her shoulder was heavy and shifting, the dead gravity weight of a body that had lost too much blood and was running on fumes and fury. They moved down the tunnel together, away from the castle, toward the deeper passages that led to the forest route. Each step was a negotiation between Kaelric's will and his body's limits. Each step cost something that couldn't be replenished. The tunnels branched and narrowed and opened and branched again. Kaelric directed her. Left here, straight, right at the carved stone, down the stairs, watch the drop. His voice getting thinner with each instruction, the words coming slower, spaced further apart, as if each one had to be paid for individually. They emerged into the forest through an opening she never would have found alone. A crack in a rock face half hidden by hanging moss, wide enough for one person to squeeze through. The pre-dawn air hit her like a slap. Cold. Clean. Alive in a way the tunnel air hadn't been. She gulped it, felt her lungs expand fully for the first time in hours. Kaelric collapsed the moment they cleared the opening, went down on his knees, then onto his side, curling around the wound in his abdomen. His face in the early gray light was the color of candle wax, and his eyes had taken on the glassy, unfocused look that Leora recognized from years of emergency work. Shock. His body was shutting down non-essential systems, redirecting everything to the core, the organs, the brain, buying time at the cost of everything else. She built a fire. Small, shielded, hidden behind the rock face where the light wouldn't carry. She boiled water from her water skin in a tin cup from her pack. She cleaned the wound properly for the first time, irrigating it, examining the depth and angle, confirming what her hands had told her in the darkness. The blade had entered below the 8th rib on the left side, angled upward. It had nicked the lower lobe of the lung. She could hear it in his breathing, the faint wet crackle that told her air was leaking where it shouldn't. But it had missed the spleen, missed the kidney, missed the major vessels. Malvern's assassin had been good, but not perfect. The blade had been aimed to kill slowly, to give Kaelric hours of declining function before the end. It was a mercy, in a way. A kill designed to look like the target had simply bled out in his sleep. Quiet. Deniable. By the time the body was found, the blood would have dried, the wound would have cooled, and the story would write itself. The king died alone. Perhaps by his own hand. Who could blame him, carrying the burden he carried? Malverin had planned for everything except the hidden passage behind the hearth, and a woman with a skinning knife and a refusal to let people die on her watch. Leora sutured the wound. Her needle was a curved surgical instrument from her father's kit, too large for the job, designed for closing field injuries on limbs, not delicate abdominal work. She made it work. She always made it work. The stitches were ugly, too wide, pulling the skin tight in ways that would leave a scar like a railroad track. But they held. The bleeding slowed, stopped. She packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow and comfrey that would fight infection and promote clotting. She bound his torso with the last of her clean linen, wrapping it tight enough to compress but loose enough to let his damaged lung expand. Then she sat beside him on the cold ground and watched the sun come up through the canopy of the blackthorn forest. The light was different here, filtered, diffused, green and gold and fragmented by 1,000 branches. Nothing like the blood moon's rust-colored assault. This was gentle light, healing light, the kind that found its way into dark places and settled there like a promise. Kaelric slept, not peacefully. His body twitched, his breathing hitched, his hands clenched and unclenched in patterns that spoke of pain even in unconsciousness. But he slept, and that was something. That was the body choosing to repair instead of fight, choosing to trust, for a few hours, that someone else was standing watch. Leora didn't sleep. She sat with her back against the rock face and her father's journals open in her lap, and she thought about what came next. Not in broad strokes, not in strategy, in the specific, mechanical, step-by-step progression of actions that would keep them alive through the next 24 hours. Step 1. Kael. She needed to get word to Marin to take Kael and leave the village. Today. Before Malverin's reach extended beyond the castle walls. Step 2. Drenna. The head of the infirmary was her only reliable contact inside the castle. Drenna needed to know what had happened, needed to understand what Malvern was doing, needed to choose a side. Step 3. The seal. In 16 days, the blood moon would rise. Kaelric needed to be strong enough to reach the underground chamber by then. If he couldn't hold the seal, the Hollow King would break free, and nothing else, not Malvern, not the court, not the politics, would matter anymore. 16 days. A wounded king. A compromised castle. An enemy who had been planning for years and was now in the open, no longer needing to hide because the endgame was in sight. Leora closed the journals. She looked at Kaelric's sleeping face, at the blood on her hands, drying in the morning air, flaking off in dark brown fragments, at the forest around them, vast and ancient and indifferent to the dramas of the small creatures that lived and died beneath its canopy. She had come into this as a healer, as someone who fixed what was broken, who mended what was torn, who restored things to the way they were before the damage. That was who she was. That was the identity she had built her life around. But there was nothing to restore here. The old structure was gone. The king's authority, the secret system of protection, the careful balance that had held for 3 centuries, Malvern had demolished it all. There was no going back to the way things were. The seal was breaking, the court was compromised, the king was bleeding in a forest, and the only person standing between total collapse and 17 days of impossible survival was a 22-year-old woman who had never fought a war, never played politics, never done anything more dangerous than argue with her mother about curfew. But she had something that Malvern didn't account for. She had already lost everything once. She had watched her father die on a kitchen table because help didn't come in time. She had learned, in the worst possible way, that waiting for the system to work was how people died. That following the rules was a luxury reserved for people who had never watched someone they loved bleed out while the world stood still around them. Malvern believed in systems, in control, in the careful manipulation of structures and hierarchies and chains of command. He had spent years infiltrating the castle's power structure because he believed that power flowed through institutions, through titles, through the architecture of authority. He was about to discover what happened when someone who didn't believe in any of that walked through his carefully constructed walls like they were made of paper. Kaelric stirred, his eyes opened, clouded, confused, then sharpening as memory flooded back. He tried to sit up. Leora pushed him back down. "Don't." "How long was I out?" 3 hours. Your body needed it. Don't fight it. "The castle is Malvern's for now. We're in the forest. You're sutured and stable, but you need at least 48 hours of rest before you can move properly." "I don't have 48 hours. Your body doesn't care about your schedule." He lay still, stared up at the canopy. The light moved across his face in shifting patterns, green and gold, and for a moment he looked younger. Not young, but the damage was too deep for that, but younger, less armored. The face he might have had if the seal and the crown and the endless solitary burden of holding back the dark had never been placed on his shoulders. "Malvern wants the Hollow King's power," Kaelric said. "He believes it will make him immortal." He's wrong. The power doesn't grant immortality. It consumes. It turns you into a vessel. You become the next Hollow King. Your mind, your will, your identity. All of it devoured and replaced by something that has been rotting underground for 300 years. Does he know that? I told him. Years ago, before I understood what he was. I told him the full history, the warning, what happened to Varethan. He listened, nodded, thanked me for my candor, and then he went right on planning to seize it anyway. So he's not just power hungry, he's delusional. He's convinced he's different, that he's stronger than Varethan was, that he can take the power and keep his mind. It's the oldest lie in the world. The belief that the thing that destroyed everyone before you will somehow spare you because you're special. The fire had died to embers. Leora fed it a handful of dry twigs and watched the flames catch. Somewhere in the forest, a bird called, a sharp, 2-note cry that echoed through the trees and faded into silence. "I need to go back," she said. Kaelric's head turned. "Back where?" "The castle. Not through the front gate. Through the tunnels. I need to reach Drenna before Malvern locks down the infirmary. And I need to send word to my mother." "Leora, he knows who you are. He has been watching you from the start. If you go back in there, he thinks I'm still inside. He thinks you're dead in your chambers and I'm sleeping in my cot, and tomorrow morning is going to unfold exactly the way he planned it. He's wrong on all three counts, and the window between what he thinks is happening and what's actually happening is the only advantage we have. I need to use it before it closes." Kaelric studied her. The morning light was in his eyes, and she could see the calculation happening behind them. The king's mind, trained since childhood to evaluate risk, measure cost, weigh the value of one life against the needs of many. She watched him arrive at the answer, watched him hate it. "Don't get caught," he said. "That's the plan." "That's a terrible plan. It's the only one we have." She stood, checked her pack, reorganized the remaining supplies. Not much left. One water skin, a handful of dried herbs, her father's surgical kit, the leather cracked and stained, the instruments inside worn by decades of use, the skinning knife on her belt. She looked down at Kaelric. Lying on the forest floor in the early morning light, wounded and stripped of every institutional power he'd ever held. No crown, no soldiers, no court, no castle. Just a man in the dirt with a hole in his side and a seal that needed holding and 16 days until the world came apart. She knelt beside him, adjusted the bandage, checked the sutures by touch. "When I come back," she said, "I'll have help, or I won't come back at all." That's not reassuring. It's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be honest. She left him there, walked back to the crack in the rock face, squeezed through into the tunnel, and disappeared into the darkness beneath the castle. Behind her in the forest, Kaelric lay still and stared at the canopy and felt the faint, distant pulse of the seal beneath the earth, weakened, fractured, straining against the thing that pressed against it from the other side. 16 days. The pulse was slower now, irregular, like a heart with a murmur, skipping beats, losing rhythm. 17 days ago, there had been a system, a structure, a way of doing things that had worked, imperfectly but functionally, for 3 centuries. A king held the seal. The court ran the kingdom. The people lived their lives in the light, while the darkness was managed underground by a single bloodline sacrifice. That system was dead now. Malverin had killed it. And what would replace it, what would have to replace it, was something none of them had ever tried before. Something that required a king to stop being a king. Something that required a healer to become a weapon. Something that required a kingdom built on secrets to survive the truth. 16 days. The blood moon was coming. And in the tunnels beneath the castle, a woman with blood on her hands and a dead man's journals in her pack was walking toward the one fight that couldn't be won with the old rules, the old powers, the old ways of holding the darkness at bay. The only question left was whether she could build something new before the old world finished burning. Leora made it back inside the castle walls 40 minutes before the morning bell. The tunnels delivered her to the maintenance junction beneath the infirmary wing, and she climbed the last set of service stairs with her father's journals pressed against her ribs and Kaelric's blood still crusted under her fingernails. She slipped into the staff quarters, stripped off her stained cloak, shoved it under her cot, and was sitting upright with clean hands and a composed face when Pella stirred awake and mumbled something about breakfast. Normal. She needed to be normal for the next 3 hours. Normal was the only armor she had left. The castle's morning routine unfolded around her like a machine designed by someone who understood that order was the most effective form of control. Guards changed shifts at the 6th bell. Kitchen staff delivered meals to the barracks at the 7th. Council members filtered into their chambers by the 8th. Everything moved, everything functioned, and at the center of it all, orchestrating the rhythm with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this day 1,000 times in his head, was Lord Malverin. Leora saw him cross the inner courtyard at 7:15 bell. He walked with 3 of his personal guards, and a clerk carrying a leather folio, and his face wore the particular expression she had come to recognize over 2 weeks of observation: composed concern. The face of a man shouldering a burden he hadn't asked for. The loyal advisor, horrified by the morning's discovery, because the discovery had been made. At the 6th bell, a chambermaid had entered the king's quarters to light the morning fire and found the room empty. Blood on the floor. The king's bed untouched. No body, no note, no explanation. The castle erupted. Leora heard the news from Pella, who heard it from a kitchen boy, who heard it from a guardsman stationed outside the royal wing. The king was missing. There was blood in his chambers. Lord Malverin had assumed emergency authority over the castle and the council, pending a full investigation. Emergency authority. The word slid through Leora's mind like a blade through silk. He had planned for Caelric to die in his chambers, to be found cold and still and beyond saving. The empty room complicated things, created questions Malverin would need to answer, but not by much. A missing king with blood in his room and no witnesses told its own story. The narrative was already being written in the whispers that moved through the castle's halls like smoke. The king had cracked under the pressure. The king had harmed himself. The king, burdened beyond endurance by the weight of the crown, had done something desperate in the night and fled into the darkness. Malverin didn't need a body. He needed an absence, and the absence was speaking louder than any corpse ever could. Leora went to the infirmary. She treated a guard with a torn ligament. She mixed a tincture for a councilman's chronic headache. She moved through her duties with the mechanical efficiency of a woman who had partitioned her mind into two halves, the half that worked and the half that planned. At the 9th bell, she found Drenna Voss alone in the supply room, counting inventory. The older woman's face was tight, drawn, the skin around her eyes creased with the particular fatigue of someone who had been woken early by bad news and hadn't stopped moving since. Leora closed the door behind her. Drenna looked up. "I need to talk to you," Leora said. "Not now. The castle's in. The king is alive." Drenna's hands stopped moving. The bottle of antiseptic she was holding remained suspended in the air between the shelf and her clipboard. Her eyes found Leora's face and stayed there, reading it the way she read symptoms, quickly, thoroughly, with a practitioner's instinct for separating truth from performance. "Shut that door properly," Drenna said. Leora did. Then she told her. Not everything. There wasn't time for everything. But enough. The seal beneath the forest, the Hollow King, Malverin's betrayal, the assassination attempt, Caelric wounded and hidden in the forest, the blood moon in 16 days. She told it fast and clean, without inflection, without drama, facts, sequence, diagnosis. Drenna listened the way she did everything, with total attention and zero visible reaction. When Leora finished, the older woman set the antiseptic bottle on the shelf, placed her clipboard on the counter, and was silent for 11 seconds. Leora counted. "Grint," Drenna said. "What?" "The soldier, the one who came back from the forest and stopped talking, stopped eating, sits in the barracks staring at the wall. I've been treating him for 3 months. The royal physician diagnosed him with battle fatigue. I disagreed. His symptoms don't match any combat trauma I've seen in 23 years. His brain isn't injured. It's overloaded, like he saw something his mind couldn't contain, and instead of breaking, it just shut the intake valve, locked the door, refused to process. The seal does that. To anyone who isn't blood-tied to the royal line." Drenna nodded, slowly, the way someone nods when a piece they've been holding for months finally finds its place in the puzzle. "What do you need?" Drenna asked. "Surgical supplies, antibiotics, whatever you have that fights deep tissue infection, suturing silk, clean bandages, enough for sustained treatment over 2 weeks. That's a lot of material to move without being noticed. I know, and if Malverin catches me, he'll kill you, the same way he tried to kill the king." Drenna picked up her clipboard again, looked at it, set it down again. Leora watched the decision happen, watched it move across the older woman's face like weather crossing a plain. Not a dramatic moment, not a grand declaration, just a woman who had spent her life fixing broken bodies, reaching the conclusion that the biggest broken thing she'd ever encountered needed fixing, and the cost of fixing it might be everything she had. "Supply room delivery is at noon," Drenna said. "I'll pack what you need in the standard resupply crates. Mark them with a red tag. You pick them up from the loading dock and take them wherever you need to take them. If anyone asks, it's overflow inventory being moved to secondary storage." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Get it done. And get a message to Marin Vale while you're at it. If her boy is at risk, she needs to move. Today." Leora was at the door when Drenna's voice stopped her. "The king. How bad is the wound?" "Puncture below the 8th rib. Nicked the lower lung lobe. I sutured it in a tunnel with field tools and bad light. He needs a proper surgeon. He's got one. Tell me where he is, and I'll come tonight." Leora looked at her. This woman, 53 years old, iron gray hair, hands that had saved more lives than most soldiers had ended, standing in a supply room in a castle controlled by a man who would slit her throat without hesitation, and volunteering to walk into a cursed forest at night to operate on a king she'd never spoken a personal word to. There was no grand reason behind it, no ideology, no political calculation, just the simple, brutal arithmetic of a healer who could help and therefore had to. Leora gave her the location, then she left. The message to Marin was harder. She couldn't use the castle's courier system. Malverin controlled it. She couldn't leave the castle herself. The gates were monitored. She needed someone who could move between the castle and the villages without raising suspicion. Rorik, the stable hand with the cracked ribs. He came to the infirmary at midday for a bandage change, and Leora rewrapped his torso while speaking in a voice too low for anyone outside arm's reach to hear. I need you to carry a message to South Village, to Marin Vale, the healer. Rorik's eyes went wide. I'm a stable hand, not a... You ride out to the southern pastures every afternoon to exercise the reserve horses. Nobody questions it. Nobody cares. You ride south, you stop at the cottage, at the edge of the village, you tell Marin Vale 3 words. Take Kale, run. That's it? That's it, she'll understand. Rorik studied her. He was a simple man. Not stupid, but simple in the way that people who work with animals are simple. Direct, uncluttered by the layered deceptions that filled the castle's upper floors. He looked at her hands, still wrapping his ribs with a care and competence that he had come to rely on over the past 2 weeks. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there convinced him. South Village, Marin Vale, take Kale, run. Don't stop, don't talk to anyone else. Go straight there and come straight back. He nodded, and he went. The noon supply delivery came on schedule. Leora identified the red-tagged crates on the loading dock, 2 of them, heavy, packed tight with everything Drenna had promised. She loaded them onto a handcart, wheeled them through the east corridor to the maintenance access point, and descended into the tunnel system for the 3rd time in 24 hours. She reached Kaelric by early afternoon. He was awake, sitting upright against the rock face outside the tunnel entrance, and his color was marginally better, so still gray, still wrong, but the waxen translucency of shock had receded slightly. His eyes tracked her as she emerged with the cart, and the relief in them was so naked and so quickly buried that she pretended not to see it. Supplies, she said, and Drenna Voss is coming tonight. She'll do a proper surgical assessment. You told her. I told her everything she needed to know. She made her own choice. And my absence from the castle? Malverin has taken emergency authority. The story being circulated is that you've either harmed yourself or fled. Nobody's questioning it because nobody wants to question it. A missing king is easier to manage than a present one. Kaelric's jaw tightened. She watched the muscle work beneath the skin, watched the tendons in his neck stand out like cables. Not rage. Not exactly. Something colder. The focused, inward-directed fury of a man watching everything he'd built being dismantled by someone he'd trusted. And the part that burned hottest wasn't the betrayal itself, but the recognition that the signs had been there for years, visible, readable, screaming in plain sight, and he had chosen not to see them, because Malverin had been useful, because Malverin had been competent, because Malverin had been the one person in the entire court who showed up on time, did the work, managed the details, and never once gave Kaelric a reason to doubt his loyalty. And the absence of doubt had become trust, and the trust had become dependence, and the dependence had become the blind spot through which a knife found its way between his ribs. This was the education that power never taught you until it was too late. The people most dangerous to you were never the ones who challenged you openly. They were the ones who made themselves indispensable, who embedded themselves so deeply into the machinery of your authority that removing them would collapse the structure, who built your trust like a wall around themselves, brick by brick, year by year, until the wall was so high and so solid that you couldn't see past it even when the fire on the other side was visible from miles away. Kaelric had spent 19 years holding the seal against the Hollow King. He had sacrificed sleep, health, relationships, every normal human connection. He had made himself into a living wall against the darkness. And while he was staring into the pit, holding the monster back with his bare hands, Malverin had been standing behind him, quietly pulling the floor out from under his feet. 15 days, Kaelric said. I know. My body won't be ready for the seal in 15 days. You know that. Drenna will get you as close as possible. The rest is going to be willpower. Willpower is what got me stabbed. Stubbornness got you stabbed. Willpower is what's going to keep you alive long enough to stop him. She unpacked the supplies, laid them out on a clean cloth on the ground beside him. Surgical thread, antiseptic wash, binding materials, a small vial of concentrated willow bark extract, the strongest pain management Drenna had access to without breaking into the restricted pharmaceutical stores. Nutrient-dense rations, 2 full water skins. She changed his bandages. The sutures were holding, but the surrounding tissue was inflamed and hot to the touch. Infection was hovering at the edges, looking for a way in. She cleaned the wound site, applied a fresh poultice, and bound it tighter than before. "You need to eat," she said. "I'm not hungry." "I didn't ask if you were hungry. I said you need to eat. Your body is trying to repair a punctured lung and close a 6-inch wound. It needs fuel. Eat, or I'll make you eat, and I promise you that will be more unpleasant for both of us." He ate. Slowly, mechanically, without tasting it. She watched him chew and swallow, and hated every second of it. Hated the weakness he was being forced to display, hated the vulnerability that a man like him experienced as a form of violence against his own identity. Kaelric had been strong for so long that weakness felt like a betrayal of self. Like the body was committing treason against the mind. She understood that. She had watched her father fight the same war in his final months. The slow, grinding erosion of capability in a man who had defined himself by what he could do for others. The cruelest thing about physical decline wasn't the pain. It was the identity theft, the forced separation between who you were and what your body would allow you to be. But she had also learned, watching her father, that the men who survived the longest were not the strongest. They were the ones who learned to let the definition of strength change, who stopped measuring themselves by what they could carry alone and started measuring by what they could build with help. Her father had never learned that lesson. He had died on Marin's table, alone in his insistence on handling everything himself, too proud to ask for the help that might have saved him. She was not going to let Kaelric make the same mistake. Drenna arrived after nightfall. She came through the tunnels carrying a surgical kit that was 3 times the size of Leora's and a lantern that threw clean, steady light. She assessed Kaelric's wound with the efficient brutality of a battlefield surgeon, pressing, probing, listening to his breathing with an ear against his ribs. "The suture work is ugly," she told Leora. "I did it in the dark with a field needle." "I know, and it saved his life. But I need to redo the deep tissue closure or the lung won't seal properly." She operated by lantern light on the forest floor. Kaelric bit down on a leather strap and stared at the canopy and made no sound while Drenna opened the wound, cleaned the internal damage, and resutured with the precise, economical movements of a woman who had done this 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more. When it was over, Kaelric was shaking. Full-body tremors, involuntary, the nervous system's response to pain that exceeded the body's capacity to process. Leora held his hand through it. Not gently, hard, anchoring him to the physical world with the pressure of her grip, giving his overwhelmed nerves something to focus on besides the screaming in his side. 12 days of rest, Drenna said, washing her instruments in boiled water. Minimum. The lung needs to reinflate fully. The tissue needs to knit. If he exerts himself before then, the internal sutures will tear and he'll bleed out inside his own chest cavity. He has 15 days until the blood moon. Then he has 12 days of rest and 3 days to do whatever it is he needs to do underground. And even that is optimistic. I'll take optimistic. Drenna left before dawn, carrying the surgical waste back through the tunnels for disposal in the infirmary's incinerator. She would continue her duties inside the castle as if nothing had changed. She would monitor Malvern's movements. She would report back through the tunnel network every 2 days. The days passed in a rhythm that Leora built from nothing. She tended Kaelric's wound twice daily. She managed his pain with carefully rationed doses of willow bark extract. She forced him to eat, to drink, to sleep, fighting his body's desire to push past its limits every hour of every day. On the 3rd day, Rorik's message came back through Drenna. Marin and Kael were gone. They had left the cottage the same afternoon Rorik delivered the warning, taking nothing but clothes and Marin's medical supplies. They were heading to Marin's sister's farm in the Eastern Highlands, 2 days' ride from Ashenmere, far enough from the forest and the castle to be beyond Malverin's immediate reach. Leora read the message and felt something unclench in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched. Kale was safe. For now. On the 5th day, Kaelric told her about the royal archives. He was sitting up now, still weak, still pale, but the tremors had stopped and his breathing was cleaner, the wet crackle in his left lung fading as the tissue healed. The infection had been beaten back by Drenna's antibiotics and Leora's aggressive wound care. He was mending. Slowly. Too slowly for the clock that was counting down above their heads, but mending nonetheless. The archives contain everything, he said. Every piece of knowledge the bloodline has accumulated about the seal, the Hollow King, the anchor points in the forest. Malverin has been trying to access the lower levels for months. I've been blocking him. But with me gone from the castle, there's nothing stopping him. Drenna says he's already moved into the royal wing. He's using the king's study as his command center. Then he has access to the upper archives already. The lower levels are locked with a blood seal, similar to the one in the forest. Only the royal line can open them. But Malverin's been studying the old scripts for years. If he's found a way to bypass the blood lock, what's in the lower archives that he doesn't already know? Kaelric was quiet. His eyes moved to the forest canopy above them, following the pattern of branches the way a man follows a familiar map. The ritual, he said, the original binding ritual that created the seal 300 years ago. It's the key to everything. If Malverin gets the full text, he doesn't just break the seal. He controls the release. He can direct the Hollow King's power instead of just unleashing it. Meaning he wouldn't just free the monster. He'd become its master. That's what he believes. What would actually happen is the power would consume him, and he'd become the next vessel. But by the time he understood that, it would be too late for everyone. 8 days passed. 9, 10. On the 11th night, Drenna didn't come. Leora waited in the tunnel entrance until an hour before dawn. No footsteps, no lantern light. Nothing. The silence pressed against her like a physical weight. She went back to Kaelric and told him. Something's wrong, she said. Go. Find out. She went through the tunnels, faster now. She knew the route blind, could navigate the junctions by counting steps, could feel the change in air pressure that told her she was approaching the castle's foundation level. She emerged into the maintenance corridor beneath the infirmary wing and climbed the service stairs to the staff quarters. Empty. Pella's cot was stripped. Gent's cot was stripped. The room had been cleaned out, personal items removed, the mattresses bare. The infirmary itself was locked. Not the standard nighttime lock, a heavy iron padlock on the outside, the kind used on prison doors. Leora stood in the dark corridor and felt the walls contract around her. She moved to the library. The tapestry on the east wall was gone. The stone wall behind it was bare, but no hidden passage entrance. It had been bricked over. Fresh mortar, still damp. Someone had sealed the service corridor from the castle side within the last 12 hours. Malverin had found the passage. He had shut it down. And Drenna was gone. Leora's pulse hammered in her ears. Her mouth went dry. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and forced herself to breathe. In through the nose, hold, out through the mouth. The breathing pattern her father had taught her for field emergencies when panic was a luxury you couldn't afford. Think. Think clearly. Drenna was either arrested or dead. The passage was sealed. The infirmary was locked. The staff had been removed. Malverin was cutting off every connection between the castle and the outside, one by one, isolating the throne from anyone who might challenge his authority. 4 days until the blood moon. Leora retreated through the tunnels. She moved fast, almost running, the darkness pressing against her face like a wet cloth. When she burst out into the forest air, Kaelric was standing. He shouldn't have been standing. His body wasn't ready. The wound wasn't healed. Drenna had said 12 days minimum. But he was on his feet, his hand braced against the rock face, his eyes sharp with the particular alertness of a man whose survival instincts had overridden his rational mind. Tell me, he said. She told him. Drenna gone. The passage sealed, the infirmary locked, their network inside the castle, dismantled in a single night. Kaelric's face didn't change. The news landed in him like a stone dropping into deep water. The surface stayed still while everything underneath rearranged. She watched his breathing shift, watched his pupils dilate, watched the muscles in his forearms tighten as his hands formed fists at his sides. He had known this was possible. He had calculated the risk from the beginning. But calculation and experience were different things. Knowing that a blade could cut you was not the same as feeling the edge. "He's accelerating," Kaelric said, moving the timeline up. "He doesn't want to wait for the blood moon. He wants to control the conditions." "Can he break the seal without the blood moon?" "Not fully. The blood moon weakens the seal at its foundation. Without that weakening, the seal holds against any external attack. But if he's found the binding ritual in the archives, if he understands the anchor points well enough, he could damage the seal so severely that the next blood moon finishes the job in minutes instead of hours. He could shatter it the moment the moon rises before I have time to reach the chamber." "Then we go to the chamber now. I can't hold the seal for 4 days straight. The physical cost? You can't hold it at all if you're dead. And if Malvern has the ritual text and 4 days to work with, he's going to use every hour. We move now. We get to the chamber. We hold whatever we can hold, and we figure out the rest on the way down." Kaelric looked at her. 4 days of recovery still showing in his face, the hollowness under his cheekbones, the dark circles carved permanent by pain and insufficient sleep, the way he held his left side with his right hand in a posture that had become unconscious. He was not ready. His body was not ready. Nothing about this was ready. But readiness was a concept that belonged to a world where you had time to prepare. That world was gone. He pushed off the rock face, stood straight. The effort cost him. She could see it in the white line that appeared around his lips, the way his nostrils flared as he managed the pain. But he stood, and he stayed standing. "The chamber," he said. They moved through the forest in the gray light of a morning that felt like the last morning of something. Kaelric led, his pace slower than it should have been, his left hand pressed against his side where the wound pulled with every step. Leora followed, carrying what was left of the supplies, her father's journals, her knife. The forest was different in daylight. The trees were still massive, still twisted in ways that didn't look natural, but the oppressive darkness of the blood moon was absent. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in broken columns, and the air smelled of pine and wet earth and something mineral underneath, the scent of the ancient stone buried below. They reached the ruins by midday, the descending stairs half swallowed by root and vegetation, the carved symbols on the walls still and silent in the daylight, their pulse dormant without the blood moon to activate them. Kaelric descended first. Leora followed. The temperature dropped. The air changed. The smell shifted from forest to stone to something deeper, older, the exhalation of a world that existed beneath the one people lived in. The chamber was as she remembered it, cathedral vast. The ceiling lost in darkness. The cracked column at the center wrapped in chains, the darkness inside it moving with that slow liquid patience that was neither shadow nor substance but something in between. But it was different too. The cracks were wider, visibly, measurably wider. 3 chain links near the base had broken completely, hanging loose like severed tendons. The symbols on the walls pulsed even without the blood moon, faint, irregular, arrhythmic, a heartbeat losing its pattern. Kaelric placed both hands on the column, closed his eyes, and Leora watched the cost hit him. His body convulsed. Not the dramatic cinematic convulsion of fiction, the ugly, involuntary kind. Muscles firing in sequences they weren't designed for, the nervous system overloaded by input it couldn't process. His back arched, his fingers dug into the stone until his nails tore. A sound came out of him that wasn't a scream, wasn't a groan, was something more fundamental. The sound of a body being used as a conduit for power it was never meant to carry. The symbols on the walls flared. The cracks in the columns stopped spreading. The loose chain links trembled, strained, and one of them, just one, resealed with a sound like a bone snapping back into place. Kaelric dropped to his knees. Blood ran from his nose, his ears, the corner of his left eye. Leora was beside him instantly, checking his pulse, checking his pupils, checking the wound on his side, which had torn open along 2 of Drenna's carefully placed sutures, fresh blood soaking through the bandage. "You just ripped your own stitches," she said. "The seal. I'll fix the seal if you die on this floor. Right now I'm fixing you." She worked fast. re-sutured the torn closure with the last of her surgical thread, packed the wound, bound it tight. His body shook under her hands, aftershocks, the nervous system trying to reset after the overload. 4 days, he whispered. I have to hold it for 4 days. Not continuously. We'll find a rotation. You hold, you rest, you hold again. There is no rotation. It's bloodlocked. Only I can... Then we find another way. There's always another way. That's what I do, Calric. I find the way that nobody thought of because nobody was desperate enough to look. He lay on the chamber floor, staring up into the infinite darkness above. The column pulsed beside him, the darkness inside it pressing, testing, probing the places where the seal had weakened. The Hollow King was awake. Had been awake, probably, for months. Feeling the cracks spread, tasting the possibility of freedom for the first time in 3 centuries. And in that darkness, in that patient, ancient intelligence, Lyora sensed something she hadn't before. Not malice, not rage, hunger. A hunger so vast and so old that it had become its own form of existence. The Hollow King didn't hate them. It didn't fear them. It simply wanted. With the bottomless, all-consuming want of a thing that had been starved for 300 years and could finally smell food. She opened her father's journals. Not the medical entries. The other ones. The coded notes. Callan Bray's testimony. And beyond those, in the final pages of the 3rd journal, entries she hadn't read yet. Entries made in the last weeks of her father's life, when his handwriting grew shaky and his observations grew strange. Her father had been researching the seal, not from the royal archives, he'd never had access to those. From older sources, village records, folk stories passed down through generations of healers, the oral history of the common people, which contained, buried under layers of superstition and embellishment, fragments of truth that the royal bloodline had never thought to look for. One entry stopped her cold. The seal was not designed to last forever. The original binding was a containment measure, not a solution. The old text suggests that the creator of the seal knew it would eventually fail and intended for a future generation to find the actual cure. The seal was a bandage, not a healing. The wound beneath it was never closed. She read it again, a 3rd time. Her father's words written by a dying man who understood wounds better than anyone she had ever known. The seal was a bandage. The wound was never closed. 300 years of kings bleeding in the dark to hold a bandage in place. 300 years of sacrifice, of secrecy, of solitary suffering, and the whole time the actual wound, the thing that had created the Hollow King in the first place, had been left untreated. Lyora looked at Calric, looked at the column, looked at the chains that had held for centuries and were now failing. Of course they were failing. Bandages always failed eventually. They weren't cures, they were delays. And 300 years was the longest delay in the history of the world, but it was still just borrowed time. The answer wasn't holding the seal. The answer was healing the wound beneath it. But the wound was a corrupted king, a human being twisted by forbidden power into something that fed on fear and madness. You couldn't suture that. You couldn't bind it. You couldn't apply a poultice and wait for it to mend. Unless the wound wasn't the Hollow King itself. Unless the wound was what had created it. The obsession with power, the hunger for immortality, the thing in the royal bloodline that had driven Varathan to drink from the ancient source 300 years ago and was now driving Malverin to do the same thing. The wound wasn't a monster. The wound was a pattern, a cycle, a disease of the crown itself. The belief that power was something to be hoarded, controlled, held by a single bloodline at the cost of everything else. The seal wasn't failing because of sabotage alone. It was failing because the disease it was meant to contain had never been cured. It had been passed down, generation to generation, king to king, the same hunger wearing different faces. Varathan, Malverin, and Calric too, holding the seal alone because the bloodline taught that sacrifice was the duty of one, not the responsibility of many. The cure wasn't more power. It wasn't a stronger seal. It wasn't a better king. The cure was ending the cycle entirely. Lyora closed the journal. Her hands were trembling. Not with fear. With the particular electricity of understanding. The moment when a diagnosis becomes clear and the treatment presents itself, terrible and obvious and unavoidable. She knew what had to happen. She knew what Kelric would have to give up. And she knew that the hardest part wouldn't be fighting the Hollow King or stopping Malvern or surviving the Blood Moon. The hardest part would be convincing a man who had defined himself by his duty to the crown that the crown itself was the disease. Above them, in the world of light and politics and human ambition, Malvern was moving his final pieces into position. His guards controlled the castle. His allies controlled the council. His knowledge of the ancient ritual gave him the keys to a power he believed would make him eternal. 4 days until the Blood Moon. 4 days until the seal shattered and the Hollow King rose and the world drowned in 3 centuries of accumulated madness. And in the chamber beneath the earth, a healer sat beside a bleeding king and held in her hands the only cure that had ever existed. A cure that would require Kelric to destroy the very thing he had spent his entire life protecting. The column pulsed, the chains groaned, the darkness pressed. 3 days, 22 hours. The Blood Moon was coming, and the cure was worse than the disease. She told him on the 3rd morning before the Blood Moon, not gently. There was no gentle way to tell a man that the thing he'd been dying to protect was the thing that needed to die. Kelric was sitting against the chamber wall, his breathing steadier now, the wound in his side closed but still pulling with every inhale. The column pulsed beside them, slower than before. The intervals between beats stretching, the rhythm of a heart running out of time. The chains held, but barely. 3 more links had cracked overnight. The darkness inside the column was no longer pressing. It was leaning, relaxed, patient the way a predator is patient when it can see the prey tiring. Leora set her father's journal open on the stone floor between them and pointed to the entry she had read 4 times in the last 12 hours. The seal was never meant to last, she said. Your ancestor knew that. He built it as a containment measure, a delay. He intended for a future generation to find the actual cure. The actual cure being what? Ending the cycle. Not the Hollow King, the thing that created the Hollow King, the obsession with holding power in a single bloodline. The crown itself. Kelric didn't move. His eyes stayed on the journal, on the shaky handwriting of a dead healer who had pieced together from village folklore what 3 centuries of kings had failed to see from inside their own legacy. The silence between them was thick enough to touch. The column pulsed. The chains hummed their low metallic song. You're telling me to give up the throne. I'm telling you the throne is the wound. The seal doesn't hold because the seal is trying to contain a disease while the host keeps feeding it. Every generation, every king who takes the crown and comes down here alone and bleeds to hold the door shut, every one of them reinforces the pattern that created the monster in the first place. Power concentrated, sacrifice isolated, the same structure, the same hunger, different face. Verathan wanted immortality. I want to protect my people. And Malvern believes he deserves the power because he's smarter than everyone before him. 3 different men. 3 different reasons. Same obsession, same result. The crown teaches you that you're the only one who can hold it, and that belief is exactly what keeps the Hollow King alive. Kelric's hands were flat on the stone floor. She watched his fingers spread, pressing into the ancient surface as if trying to feel something beneath it. His face was the face of a man whose internal architecture was being dismantled while he was still standing inside it. Every beam, every wall, every load-bearing assumption that had held the structure upright for 19 years. She was pulling them out one by one and showing him that the building had been unstable from the foundation. If I give up the crown, he said. His voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man walking on ice and testing every step. If I renounce the bloodline's claim to power, what happens to the seal? According to the old texts, the real old texts, the ones your archives don't have because they were preserved in village oral tradition, not royal records, the seal responds to the intent of the bloodline. It was created by a king who seized power and then tried to contain the consequences of that seizure. The seal holds because the bloodline insists on holding. If the bloodline releases, truly releases, not as a tactic, not as a strategy, but as a genuine surrender of the claim, the seal dissolves. And the Hollow King? The Hollow King exists because the power was taken and hoarded. If the hoarding ends, the corruption has nothing to feed on. The entity collapses. Not destroyed, dissolved. The way a fever breaks when the infection is cleared. the way a wound closes when you stop reopening it. You're asking me to bet the survival of the entire kingdom on a theory from a village healer's journal. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that 300 years of doing it your way hasn't worked. That the seal is failing not because Malverin is sabotaging it, but because sabotage is possible, because the system was always fragile, always dependent on a single point of failure, always one betrayal away from collapse. Malverin didn't create the vulnerability. He exploited one that was built into the design. The column cracked, a sound like old timber splitting. Both of them turned. A fissure ran up the stone from the base to shoulder height, and from inside it, the darkness bulged outward, not escaping, not yet, but testing, measuring. The Hollow King had felt the seal weaken further. It was adjusting its pressure. Kaelric stood. The movement cost him. She could see it in the white flash across his face, the involuntary hitch in his breathing. But he stood, and he placed his hands on the column, and the blue-white light flared in his eyes as he pushed the seal back. The fissure closed by a fraction. The darkness retreated by an inch. He held it for 90 seconds. Then his arms dropped, and he staggered back, catching himself against the wall, blood on his lip, his chest heaving. "That used to hold for hours," he said. "Now I get 90 seconds. Because you're fighting the symptom, not the disease. And if you're wrong, if I surrender the crown and the Hollow King doesn't collapse, if it just walks free into a kingdom with no seal and no king and no defense?" Leora met his eyes. She didn't flinch. She didn't soften. She gave him the same answer she would have given any patient facing a terminal diagnosis with one experimental treatment left. "Then we die. But we die trying something new instead of repeating something that's already failed." He was quiet for a long time after that. Hours. He sat against the wall and stared at the column and listened to the chains and said nothing. Leora let him. This wasn't a decision you talked someone into. This was a death and a rebirth, happening in the same body at the same time, and the only thing she could do was be present while it happened. The blood moon rose on schedule. Leora felt it before she saw it. A change in the air pressure, a deepening of the hum that vibrated through the chamber walls, a tightening of the symbols on the stone as they flared from dormant pulse to active blaze. The column responded instantly. The cracks widened. The chains screamed, high, metallic, agonized, as link after link began to fracture under the strain. Kaelric was on his feet. His body was running on something beyond adrenaline, beyond willpower, beyond anything that belonged to normal human physiology. The blue-white light blazed in his eyes, and his hands were on the column, and the seal responded to his blood and his intent and his 19 years of sacrifice by holding. Barely, impossibly, at a cost that was visibly destroying him. Blood from his nose, his ears, his eyes. The wound in his side tore open for the second time, Drenna's careful sutures shredding under the physical force that the seal was channeling through his body. His face was a mask of agony so total that it had circled past expression and into something blank, something peaceful. The peace of a man who had exceeded his own capacity for suffering and arrived on the other side. Then the first chain broke. Not a link, a chain, an entire length of ancient iron snapping like a dry branch, whipping free from the column and crashing into the chamber wall with a force that cracked the stone. The sound was catastrophic. The echoes multiplied in the vast space, overlapping, building, becoming a roar that drowned out everything. The darkness inside the column surged, not pressing now, pouring, flooding through the widening cracks like water through a broken dam. And in the flood, taking shape for the first time in 3 centuries, was the Hollow King. It was not what Leora expected. Not a monster, not a beast, a man. Or what had been a man 300 years ago, before the power ate everything that made him human and left behind a shell animated by hunger. Verethan's face was still there. You could see the bones of it, the structure, the echo of the king he had been. But the eyes were holes, not empty, full. Full of the collected madness of every person the curse had touched, every soldier who had followed a king into the forest and come back broken, every mind that had cracked against the seal's outer defenses. 3 centuries of absorbed insanity looking out through a face that used to belong to a man who wanted to live forever. The Hollow King didn't roar, didn't charge. It stood at the base of the shattered column and looked at Kaelric the way a mirror looks at the person standing in front of it. Recognition, kinship, the acknowledgement of a shared bloodline, a shared hunger, a shared pattern repeating across generations. And then it spoke. Not in words, in feeling, in the language that bypassed the ears and went straight to the brainstem, to the ancient part of the mind that remembered what it was like to be prey. It showed Kaelric his father dying, showed him the moment the old king's heart gave out in this very chamber, alone, holding the seal with his last breath. It showed him his mother's face in the weeks after, hollow, aged 20 years in a month, the life going out of her like light fading from a window. It showed him every soldier he'd lost, every mind that broke. Grint, sitting in the barracks staring at nothing. Callan Bray, missing 2 fingers and his sanity. The young ones who never came back at all, whose bodies were somewhere in the forest, whose families still waited for them. It showed him himself. 19 years old, standing in this chamber for the first time, terrified, alone, the crown still new on his head, and the weight of it already crushing. Every blood moon since, every night underground, every morning returning to a castle full of people who feared him and a court full of people who used him. It showed him what he was. Not a hero, not a protector, a prisoner. Chained to the same column as the Hollow King, just from the outside instead of the inside. 2 men trapped in the same cycle, 2 faces of the same disease. Kaelric screamed. The sound tore from him with a force that had nothing to do with his lungs and everything to do with the place inside him, where he'd stored 19 years of grief and isolation and the particular agony of carrying a burden that nobody else could see. The sound filled the chamber, shook the walls, made the cymbals flare white-hot. The Hollow King stepped forward. 1 step. 2. Moving toward Kaelric with the slow, inevitable gravity of a thing that had waited 300 years for this moment and had no intention of being stopped. And then Leora moved, not toward the Hollow King, toward Kaelric. She grabbed his face with both hands, pulled his eyes to hers, and held him there. His skin was burning. His eyes were wild, half brown, half blue-white, the seal and the man fighting for control of the same body. "Look at me," she said. "Not at him. At me. I can't hold it. It's too strong. The seal, forget the seal. The seal is over. Kaelric, listen to me. The seal is over." The Hollow King was 5 feet away. 4. The darkness around it was spreading, flowing across the chamber floor like oil, and where it touched the stone, the symbols went dark, extinguished. The seal's architecture collapsing section by section, wall by wall. "You need to let it go," Leora said. "Not the seal, the crown, the claim, the bloodline's grip on this power. You need to let it go, Kaelric. All of it, right now. If I let go and it doesn't work, then it doesn't work and we die here, and somebody else figures it out after us. But you have been holding this door shut for 19 years and it is killing you, and it is not working. It was never going to work, because the door was never supposed to be held. It was supposed to be opened. 3 feet. The Hollow King's hand was reaching forward. Its fingers were long, pale, wrong. The fingers of a king who had grasped for immortality and gotten something else entirely. The touch of those fingers would do what the curse had done to every mind it reached. It would break him, absorb him, turn him into the next link in the chain. Kaelric looked at Leora. In his eyes, the blue-white light was fading. Not because the seal was strengthening, because he was letting it go. Releasing the grip he'd held since he was 19 years old, opening the fist that had been clenched so long the muscles had forgotten any other shape. "I don't know who I am without this," he said. "Neither do I. We'll figure it out." He let go. Not a dramatic gesture, not a shout or a declaration or a grand renunciation. He simply stopped holding, the way you stop holding your breath, the way you stop clenching your jaw, the way you release a weight you've been carrying so long you forgot you were carrying it until the moment you set it down, and your whole body rises by an inch. The seal dissolved. The symbols on the walls went dark. The chains fell from the column, not breaking, not snapping, just falling. Releasing. The iron hitting the stone floor with a sound like a bell, resonant and final and clean. The Hollow King stopped. Its reaching hand froze in the air. Its whole eyes widened, and for one instant something flickered behind them. Not madness, not hunger. Confusion. The expression of a thing that had been pushing against a door for 3 centuries and suddenly found the door wasn't there anymore. The darkness around it shuddered, contracted. The spreading oil on the floor reversed, pulling back toward the source, condensing. The Hollow King's form flickered, solid, translucent, solid again, and then began to unravel. Not violently, not with pain or fury or resistance. Quietly. The way fog dissolves when the sun reaches it. The way ice turns to water. A phase change. A transition from one state to another. Verithan's face emerged one final time from the dissolving darkness. Not the monster's face. The man's face. The original face. Young. Frightened. The face of a king who had wanted so desperately to live that he'd destroyed everything he was in the attempt. And in that face, before it faded, Leora saw something she recognized. The look her father had worn in his final hours. Not peace, exactly. Release. The letting go of a fight that could never be won, and the discovery that the surrender was not defeat, but the first honest act in a lifetime of struggle. The Hollow King dissolved. The darkness collapsed into itself, smaller and smaller, a black point in the center of the chamber that pulsed once, twice, and then vanished. Not destroyed. Returned. Whatever the ancient power had been before Verithan seized it, it went back to that. Into the stone. Into the earth. Into the deep foundations of the world where it had existed before any king put his hands on it. The chamber went dark. Completely dark. The symbols were dead. The chains lay silent on the floor. The columns stood whole, the cracks sealed, the stone smooth and unmarked as if 3 centuries of imprisonment had been a dream the earth barely remembered. Kelric collapsed. Not from injury, from absence. The thing that had lived inside him since he was 19, the seal's anchor, the bloodline's chain, the constant hum of power and responsibility and sacrifice, was gone. And what was left was a man. Just a man. Lying on a stone floor in the dark, breathing clean air for the first time in 19 years. Leora sat beside him. She couldn't see him. The darkness was total. But she could hear him breathing, and after a while she felt his hand find hers in the blackness, and his fingers closed around her palm, and they sat there together in the silence that exists after a war ends and before the world decides what comes next. "Is it gone?" he asked. His voice was raw, stripped. "Yes. The seal, the curse, all of it. All of it." He was quiet for a long time. She felt his hand trembling in hers. Not with cold, not with pain. With the particular tremor that comes when every structure you've built your life around vanishes in a single instant, and you find yourself standing in open space with no walls, no ceiling, no floor. Vertigo. The vertigo of a man who had defined himself by what he carried, now standing empty-handed. "I don't feel like a king anymore," he said. "You're not. That should scare me." "Does it?" Silence. His breathing, hers. The dead air of a chamber that had been the center of a 300-year war and was now just a room underground. Stone and iron and darkness and 2 people sitting on the floor. "No," he said. "It doesn't." They climbed the stairs at dawn. The forest had changed. Leora felt it the moment they emerged from the ruins. Something in the air, in the quality of the light, in the way the trees held themselves. The twisted, tortured shapes of the blackthorn trunks were softening, not healed, not overnight, but beginning. The slow, incremental unbending of wood that had been warped by centuries of dark energy pressing upward through the root systems. The forest was exhaling, releasing a held breath that had lasted 300 years. The blood moon was gone. The sky was clear. Dawn light came through the canopy in clean, unbroken columns that reached the forest floor for the first time in living memory. They walked south. Slowly. Kelric's body was wrecked, the reopened wound bleeding through its bandages, his muscles shaking with exhaustion, his face the color of old ash. But he walked. One foot, then the other. The simplest, most fundamental act of survival, performed by a man who had nothing left except the choice to keep moving. They reached the forest edge as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Below them, spread across the valley in the morning light, was the kingdom. The castle. The villages. The fields and roads and rivers that had been the domain of the blood-sealed crown for 3 centuries. All of it visible. All of it real. And for the first time, none of it his. Kaelric stopped at the tree line, looked at the kingdom that had been his burden and his identity and his cage. His face showed something Leora had never seen on it before. The raw, naked confusion of a man meeting himself for the first time. Not the king, not the seal holder, not the sacrificial guardian, the man underneath all of that. The one who had been buried at 19 and was now standing in sunlight at 38, blinking, uncertain, alive. What happens now? He asked. Now you go down there and tell them the truth. All of it. The seal, the Hollow King, Malvern, the 3 centuries of secrecy. You tell them everything, and then you tell them you're not their king anymore. They'll call me a traitor. Some will. Others will understand. The ones who've lost family to the forest, the ones who've watched soldiers come back broken, the ones who've spent their whole lives feeling that something was wrong but never knowing what. You give them the truth, and you let them decide what to do with it. And Malvern? Malvern tried to seize a power that no longer exists. The ritual he stole from the archives is useless now. The Hollow King is gone. The seal is gone. The ancient source has returned to the earth. He's a man who committed treason for a prize that isn't there anymore. Kaelric almost smiled. Not quite. His body didn't have the energy for smiles. But the muscles around his eyes shifted by a fraction, and something in the set of his jaw eased, and that was close enough. They descended the hill together. Word traveled ahead of them. She didn't know how, didn't know who saw them emerge from the tree line, but by the time they reached the valley floor, people were gathering. Villagers, farmers, women with children on their hips and men with tools in their hands, and old people who leaned on each other and stared at the king walking down the road in torn, blood-stained leather, with a healer's daughter beside him and no crown on his head. Sergeant Breck was there, alive. Released from his cell by guards who had abandoned their posts when the chains in the underground chamber fell, and the sound traveled through the castle's foundations like an earthquake. He stood at the front of the crowd with Darrow beside him, both men in rumpled uniforms, both men looking at their king with expressions that mixed relief and bewilderment in equal measure. Drenna was there too, bruised, thinner. She'd been held in the castle's lower cells since Malvern locked down the infirmary. The collapse of the seal had cracked the cell walls, and she'd walked out through the rubble. She looked at Leora across the crowd and nodded once. Just once. The nod of a woman who had bet everything on a stranger's plan and been proven right. And who would never say I told you so because that wasn't the kind of woman she was. Malvern was brought forward in chains by his own guards, the men he'd handpicked and transferred from his family estate, who had turned on him the moment the ancient power vanished and left behind nothing but a disgraced lord in a room full of useless stolen texts. He stood before Kaelric with his chin high and his gray eyes burning with the particular fury of a man who had been beaten not by a superior force, but by the absence of the prize he'd sold his soul to win. You destroyed it, Malvern said. Not a question. A verdict. The power. The source. Everything. It was never ours to hold, Kaelric said. It was ours by right, by blood, by 3 centuries of suffering, 3 centuries of kings dying alone underground, 3 centuries of soldiers losing their minds, 3 centuries of a kingdom living in fear of a moon because nobody had the courage to let go. Malvern's face contorted, the smooth, controlled mask cracking for the first time, showing the raw thing underneath. Not ambition, not cunning, but a desperate, childlike rage. The tantrum of a man who had spent his entire life building toward a single moment and been told at the threshold that the door opened onto an empty room. You gave up everything, Malvern said, for nothing. You had the power of centuries in your blood, and you surrendered it to a healer's theory and a dead man's journal. I gave up a cage, Kaelric said, and I'd do it again. Malvern was taken away. Leora didn't watch him go. She was watching Kaelric's face as he turned to the crowd. The hundreds of people who had gathered in the valley, who had lived their entire lives under the shadow of a curse they didn't understand, who were looking at their king and seeing something they'd never seen before. Vulnerability. Honesty. A man with nothing left to hide. He told them everything. Standing in the morning light, swaying slightly from blood loss and exhaustion, his voice rough and cracking at the edges, but carrying across the silence of the crowd with the clarity of someone who was finally speaking without a script. The seal, the Hollow King, the generations of secret sacrifice, Malvern's betrayal, the truth about the Blood Moon, and the decision, his decision, to end the monarchy, to dissolve the throne, to break the pattern that had created the nightmare in the first place. "I was your king," he said. "I'm not anymore. Not because I was defeated, because the crown was the problem. It always was. One person holding all the power, all the secrets, all the weight. It doesn't work. It never worked. It just took 300 years and a woman brave enough to tell me the truth for any of us to see it." The crowd was silent. Not the hostile silence of rejection, not the warm silence of acceptance. The bewildered silence of people processing a reality shift so fundamental that their minds needed time to catch up. Then Breck stepped forward, removed his helmet, held it against his chest. "What do we do now?" he asked. And Kaelric said the words that would reshape the kingdom more thoroughly than any crown or curse or seal ever had. "We decide together." The weeks that followed were chaotic. The council was dissolved. Malvern and his conspirators were imprisoned after public proceedings that laid bare every detail of the plot. The evidence was overwhelming. Lior's notes, Kaelric's testimony, the stolen archive texts found in Malvern's quarters, the accounts of the guards who had carried out his orders. The kingdom watched its own secrets exposed in daylight and reacted the way any organism reacts to a wound being cleaned. With pain first, then relief, then the slow recognition that the pain was part of the healing. A new governing body was formed. Not a council of lords. A council of the people, drawn from every district, every trade, every station. Breck was elected to represent the military. Drenna represented the healers. Rorik, the stable hand with the cracked ribs, was chosen by the castle's service staff. A farmer named Thessa, who had lost 2 sons to the Blackthorn Forest over the years, spoke for the outer villages. It was messy. It was slow. Decisions that Kaelric could have made in minutes took days of argument and compromise and revision. The new council argued about everything: taxation, land rights, military structure, trade policy. They argued loudly and publicly and without the polished restraint of the old court. It was, Leora thought, the healthiest sound she had ever heard. Merrin and Kael returned from the eastern highlands 2 weeks after the blood moon. Kael was taller, or maybe he just stood straighter. The experience in the chamber had left marks on him, nightmares mostly, and a wariness around dark enclosed spaces that would probably never fully leave. But his laugh was intact. That ridiculous, unbridled, room-brightening laugh that made everyone within earshot feel like the world was kinder than they thought. Merrin came back to her cottage and her practice and her herbs and resumed healing the villages as if she'd never left. She didn't ask Leora for details about what had happened in the chamber. She didn't need to. She looked at her daughter's face and saw everything she needed to know. The new lines around the eyes, the steadier set of the jaw, the particular stillness that comes into a person when they've been through something that burned away everything non-essential and left only what matters. "You look like your father," Merrin said. It was the kindest thing anyone had ever said to her. Months passed. The Blackthorn Forest continued its slow transformation. The twisted trees straightened by degrees, the canopy thinned to allow more light, and the oppressive energy that had kept people away for generations faded to a memory. Children began playing at the forest's edge. Hunters returned to the trails. The creek where Kael had wandered on Blood Moon night ran clear and cold and ordinary. The kingdom learned to live without a crown. It wasn't easy. There were disputes. There were power struggles within the new council. There were people who missed the simplicity of a single ruler and said so loudly. But the disputes were resolved through argument rather than decree. The power struggles were conducted in public rather than behind closed doors. And the people who missed the monarchy were free to voice their dissent without fear. Kaelric left the castle. Not dramatically. Not in exile. He simply walked out one morning with a bag on his shoulder and his sword on his back, and the quiet, slightly bewildered expression of a man who had been released from a cage and was still learning to walk without walls. He built a house at the edge of the Blackthorn Forest. Small, stone, one room with a fireplace and a window that looked out over the trees. He built it himself, poorly at first, with the clumsy hands of a man who had never done manual labor, but improving day by day as the work taught him what the throne never had. That building something from nothing with your own hands was a different kind of power, a kind that didn't take from anyone else, a kind that left the world with one more thing in it instead of one less. Leora came to visit on the day he finished the roof. She brought supplies. Medical supplies, because she would always be a healer first and everything else second. And she brought the journals, her father's 3 leather-bound books, which she placed on the shelf Kaelric had built beside the fireplace. For the record, she said. He looked at the journals, then at her. The blue-white light was gone from his eyes, had been gone since the night in the chamber. What remained was brown, just brown. The ordinary, unremarkable brown of a man who was no longer connected to ancient power, no longer bound to a seal, no longer carrying the weight of 3 centuries of bloodline obligation. And in those ordinary brown eyes was something she had never seen before. Not when he was a king, not when he was fighting the Hollow King, not when he was bleeding in a tunnel beneath his own castle. Peace. Not the absence of pain, the presence of something that had taken root in the place where the pain used to live. Something quiet and stubborn and real, like a seedling growing in the crack of a broken stone. Stay, he said. One word. No command, no royal decree, no authority behind it. Just a man in a house he'd built with his own hands, asking a woman to stay, because she was the only person in the world who had seen him at his worst and chosen to stand beside him anyway. Leora looked at him, at the house, at the forest stretching out behind it, still healing, still unbending, still becoming something new after 3 centuries of being twisted by a power that was never meant to be held. She set down her pack. Someone's got to keep an eye on those stitches, she said. He almost smiled. She almost smiled. Neither of them was quite ready for smiling. There was too much scar tissue, too much memory, too many nights in the dark behind them, and too many uncertain mornings ahead. But the almost was there. The space where the smile would go when the time came, when the healing had progressed enough for the muscles to remember what they were for. The blood moon rose that night, the first one since the seal broke. Leora stood at the window of the small stone house and watched it climb the sky, slow, swollen, rust-colored, and felt nothing. No fear, no dread, no ancient weight pressing down from the stratosphere. Just a moon. Just light reflected from a star onto a rock orbiting a world where people lived and suffered and healed and built and started over. Kaelric stood beside her, not touching, close. Does it bother you? She asked. He watched the moon for a long time. The light fell across his face, of the scars, the lines, the permanent marks of 19 years spent underground fighting something nobody else could see. But the face wasn't tight, wasn't guarded, wasn't performing. It was just a face. A tired, weathered, 38-year-old face belonging to a man who had lost everything he thought defined him, and discovered in the wreckage that he was still there. No, he said. It's just a moon. Below them, in the valley, the kingdom slept. No soldiers at the gates, no locked doors, no whispered fears of what the red light might bring. Just 1,000 ordinary lives unfolding in the darkness, protected not by a crown or a seal or the secret sacrifice of a single bloodline, but by the simple, radical, terrifying decision to trust each other with the truth. The moon climbed higher. The light turned everything to rust and gold. And in a small stone house at the edge of a healing forest, 2 people who had walked through the worst of each other and come out the other side stood at a window and watched the night pass without fear, without burden, without a kingdom on their shoulders. Just themselves. Just the quiet. Just the long, slow work of learning to live without walls. It was enough.